Hey guys, welcome back to the official Mr. Ballin Campfire. Tonight I have two awesome stories to tell you. They are both of the strange variety. In both stories, we're going to talk about a tragedy, but it is not the tragedy that is the reason we remember these things. We remember these events, or we still talk about these events, because in both stories, there are elements that just nobody can fully explain. There are truly unexplained phenomena that are fascinating, that are terrifying, and I know you're gonna love it. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and replace their shoelaces with 20-foot long shoelaces. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's stories. Just before 10 a.m. on November 14, 1995, a 19-year-old man named Zhang ran down a dark street toward a bus stop on the outskirts of Beijing, which is the capital city of China. Zhang, who worked at a fast food restaurant, had gotten off work late, and so now he had to catch this bus because it was the last one out of the area, and if he missed it, he'd be stranded. So this area where Zhang worked was actually a pretty historic district in Beijing. It was home to several old palaces and shrines that were built at the foot of this mountain called Baiwang Mountain. And so this area was sort of like a popular tourist area. And so during the day, it was very busy. There was lots of cabs coming in and out of the area. But at night, it was basically deserted and no cabs came through here. So again, the bus really was his only shot of getting out here unless he wanted to walk on foot, and that was just not practical. And so Zhang continued running along until he turned the corner, and up ahead he saw the bus stop, and he didn't see the bus. It was just basically a deserted street, but standing near the bus stop was this old woman, and it appeared like she was waiting for the bus, which suggested to Zhang that he had not missed the final bus, because clearly she was waiting for it too, unless she also missed it perhaps, but it just seemed like she hadn't. And so Zhang, who by this point is like kind of out of breath, he stopped running and he walked the last distance up to the bus stop where this woman was. And as he approached her, she kind of turned and looked at him like, "Who are you? You know, it's late at night. She's all alone. You know, it's just kind of weird." But she looked at him and he kind of just smiled at her to signal like, "I'm no threat. You know, I'm just here for the bus too." And then before the two could even talk, Zhang heard the sound of a bus approaching. And he turned and here comes bus 375. It came to a stop. The old woman climbed on, and Zhang followed up right after her. A moment later, Zhang was inside the bus. The doors had closed behind him. The driver had taken off from the curb. Zhang had paid the ticket seller, who was separate from the driver, sitting in sort of the front right seat. And the woman who had been in front of him, she also had paid. She had sat down in the row right next to the ticket seller, right behind the driver. And Zhang, even though the whole bus was empty, nobody else is on here except for these three people, he just sat down right behind the old woman. And so he takes his seat, you know, they're driving down the road and, you know, it's late at night, he's tired, he's had a long shift. And so for a little while, Zhang just looked out the window and watched all the, you know, imperial gardens and the shrines and all the various landmarks that drew people to the area. You know, this was again sort of a touristy area. He's just watching it all pass by. You know, it's late, it's dark, he can't see much out there. But eventually, you know, relatively soon after they had started, they passed by sort of all the touristy stuff and they entered into this stretch of road that Zhang was very familiar with. He took bus 375 home all the time. That, you know, this stretch was very desolate. There was no more buildings, no more anything. It was just kind of forest and wild on either side of the road. And so as a result, at night, driving this desolate stretch was very, very dark. There was just literally no lights. And so once they were in this sort of desolate stretch, Zhang found himself just kind of leaning back and closing his eyes because it was a little bit of a ride before he'd get to his stop and get off the bus. And so he just closed his eyes and he's trying to kind of nod off, and they're driving for a little while and he kind of felt himself beginning to fall asleep when suddenly he felt the bus start to slow down. Now, there was no indication within the bus that anything had happened. Zhang knew that it was way too early to be at the next bus stop, And so immediately he opened his eyes and he's just kind of looking around for some cue from the driver or the ticket seller or even this woman, like what was going on here. But then the bus came to a full stop and it's so dark outside that Zhang like literally can't see what's going on out there. And no one's saying anything. And the driver just kind of inexplicably gets up from his seat and he walks out of the bus. Like he exits the bus, which was odd. Like there's no clear reason for this. And so Zhang, the woman, even the ticket seller, they're kind of just like peering out the window, out the front window of the bus to see what's going on. But given how dark it was outside and the fact that there was really only light inside the bus, it had the effect of just kind of making all the interior glass of the bus be sort of reflective, like really difficult to look out. Imagine sitting inside of a dark room with a light and being surrounded by glass. It'd be impossible to look out at. All you would see was like a mirror effect all around you. And so for a minute, Zhang and the others are just kind of like wondering what's happening. What did the driver see? And then Zhang heard something outside the bus that sounded like people talking, or maybe he thought it was people talking. And so he pressed his face up to the glass and put his hands up to it to see if he could cut through that sort of mirror effect to see what was going on out there. And at first it was just darkness. He couldn't see anything. But eventually his eyes adjusted, and on his side of the bus, on the road, the driver clearly was interacting with what looked like multiple people, like 2, maybe even 3 people that are down there. There didn't appear to be, any other vehicle. Like it just wasn't clear what was happening, but there was definitely people outside of the bus. And so Zhang and the others, no one's talking. They're all just kind of trying to make sense of what's happening. And then before anybody could ask any questions, the driver comes back on the bus, sits down in the driver's seat, and then behind him come these 3 new people who presumably were the same people the driver was speaking to outside the bus. They also are likely the reason the driver stopped in the first place, although again, it's very unclear why they stopped in the first place. Like there's no reason to be stopping here, but Zhang at this point just wants to get home. He doesn't really care. But these 3 people, they come on board the bus, and immediately Zhang and the woman and the ticket seller, they're all looking at them like, what's going on here? So there were 3 men, and they were all wearing these traditional silk robes. There were 2 in blue, and there was 1 in red. And the 2 men in blue were like physically holding up the 3rd man in red, almost like he couldn't stand on his own. Like picture somebody who was like really intoxicated, like he couldn't quite stand. But immediately Zhang clocked that this guy didn't look drunk or something. He looked hurt. Like he was covered in mud and like grime, as if he had been like rolling around on the ground or something, or maybe he had fallen or whatever. Like it wasn't clear, but something happened to this guy. And the 2 guys in blue, who their robes are pristine, they're holding this guy up, and they kind of bring him into the bus, and then without saying anything to these people on the bus, they just kind of dragged this man, who was conscious, but again, barely able to stand, down the aisle, past Zhang, past the others, to the back of the bus where they took their seat. And then it was like nobody said anything. The driver didn't acknowledge how bizarre this whole thing was. He just pulled away and started driving. And then before long, it's like Zhang is just sitting there, really unclear, like what's even happening. But as they're driving along, he just felt so uncomfortable. The woman right in front of him, she had gone, back to looking straight ahead. She's not paying attention to what's happening behind her. Same with the ticket seller. But Zhang, he just felt really uncomfortable. And specifically what he felt was, it just seemed like the 3 guys in the back, the silk robe guys, 1, they were completely silent, eerily silent. And 2, it just felt like Zhang, it was almost like he could feel them staring at him. Not just looking straight ahead towards the front of the bus, but it was like they were looking at him. It was like a primal sense that Zhang had. And the more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became, and frankly, the more fearful he became. Like it was like every little noise behind him was like confirmation that they were like looking at him, or maybe moving up the aisle to get closer to him. But he couldn't bring himself to turn around and look. It was like he was terrified of what he was going to see behind him. And so he just stayed glued to his seat, rigidly looking straight ahead. But again, it was like this whole ride, he's just like, they're staring at me, something is off, like what's going on with these guys? And it went on and on for like 10, 15 minutes of just this really tense ride. But despite how sort of awful this ride had become, even though he couldn't fully articulate exactly why it was just so uncomfortable, despite all that, Zhang is thinking, any minute now, we're going to get to my stop, I'm going to get off the stupid bus, and this is going to be over and done with, and I'll forget all about this stuff. But before they reached his stop, while they're still in this sort of isolated part of the ride where it's very dark outside, Zhang, who again is just sort of glued, looking straight ahead, he notices the woman right in front of him, who this whole time has seemingly completely forgot about the guys behind her. Like, she's just looking straight ahead, no big deal. She just all of a sudden turns around and looks towards the back of the bus. Just one fluid motion. She just turned and looked. And Zhang, he's staring at the woman as she does this. And he watches as her face goes from, curious and just sort of normal to her eyes going wide. And she stands up and she just starts screaming and pointing towards the back of the bus. And then before Zhang can turn around himself, and he's still too scared to even look, he feels something smack into the side of his head. And so he's like disoriented. It hits him again and again. And he realizes it's the woman who's screaming at whatever's happening in the back of the bus. And she's hitting him over and over again with her purse. And she's yelling something. And Zhang's like, what is going on? He's realizing she's screaming, thief, at Zhang. She's hitting him in the head, screaming thief. He's got no clue why. He doesn't know why she's yelling at whatever's happening in the back. And before long, the bus driver just stops the bus, and without even asking what's going on, he just looks at Zhang and just gestures, get off the bus. As if Zhang is like the central issue on this bus. Not the strange people we've picked up 20 minutes ago that no one has any explanation for. No explanation for why this woman is screaming about whatever they're doing back there. The bus driver has just decided that Zhang is the issue. And Zhang, at this point, does just want to get off the bus. He doesn't want to be here. And so without even looking at the back, he just got up, no questions asked, breezed past the woman who's still hitting him with her bag, and out the door he goes. He didn't care. He knew he had a long walk home, but anything was better than being in that bus. Now, once Zhang actually got off the bus, he realized he actually was not in as bad of a spot as he could have been. Like, he expected to get off and basically be in the middle of nowhere because he knew they were in this sort of isolated area. But when he got off, he realized they had sort of just came to the end of that isolated section. And so pretty nearby, he could see a neighborhood, which meant he actually was not that far away from his home. And so he's thinking, okay, I got a bit of a walk, but again, thank goodness I'm not on that bus. I don't even want to think about what's happening on that crazy bus. Like, thank goodness I'm just out of there. And so Zhang, he just starts walking towards his home and he's making his way when he hears something behind him. And he immediately stops because think about how traumatic whatever just happened was for him. He can't process what's happened. It's this totally crazy, inexplicable thing. He's on the side of the road now, like he's on edge. And so he hears something behind him and he just stops. And this time, unlike on the bus, he does turn around to see what's going on. And he turns and he sees he's not alone. Standing behind him on the sidewalk is the old woman. And she's staring right at him. And so Zhang, he's looking at her and immediately he clocks that like something's different about her. On the bus, that expression she had on her face when she screamed at whatever was in the back of the bus and then began hitting him with her purse, that expression she had was like fear and paranoia and even anger. That's what he saw on her face. But now she's like smiling and she's looking at him with this almost like I'm sorry look on her face. Like please, I want to talk to you about what just happened. Like she was signaling to him like we need to talk. And so picking up on that, Zhang, like he wanted to just go over to her and be like, what are you doing? Like, why did you do that to me? I didn't take anything from you. Like he wanted to yell at her. But again, there was just that look on her face that said, like, I got to go talk to this woman. And so Zhang, he turns and he walks to this woman and he says to her, like, what happened on there? Like, what's going on? Like, what did you see? What happened? And she looked at him and she was like, I have to tell you a secret. So that night, unbeknownst to Zhang and very likely unbeknownst to this woman, this bus they were on, bus 375, after they got off, it would take off and drive off with its strange occupants on board. And believe it or not, the bus would vanish. It would just go missing. Nobody knew where it went. And then 3 days later, it was found crashed in a reservoir 60 miles north of where Zhang and this woman had gotten off. And on board the bus were 3 dead bodies. It was the driver, the ticket seller, and then also the man wearing red, the guy who was needing to be propped up by the other two men in blue. Now, authorities made no mention of the men in blue. It was just these three people were found on board the bus. Now, it was determined that all three of them had died from a broken neck. And so the running assumption was the crash itself caused them to break their necks, and that's what killed them. But there was a very strange determination about the condition of the bodies. So the occupants on board the bus presumably died within 72 hours, because that's the time frame they were missing and when they were found dead. But it was determined that their bodies were so decomposed they likely had been dead for months. The secret that the old woman told Zhang was that when she turned around on the bus and she looked to the back and she saw the men, she said the men in blue were staring at Zhang with just a look of pure evil on their face. She was like, I knew it wasn't right. These were evil spirits, and they were after Zhang. It was like she instinctively just knew it. She didn't know why, she just knew it. And almost like reflexively, she began screaming. And then it was like this thought crossed her mind that she needed to save Zhang. And the first thing she thought to do was accuse him of being a thief so the bus driver would stop and kick him off the bus. And so she put on this performance, hitting him, calling him a thief, basically to save him, to get him off the bus away from what she thought were literally evil spirits. And so think about this. She's telling Zhang this on the side of the road. They're in the middle of nowhere. Their ride is pulling away. Zhang wasn't like, oh boy, thank you so much for saving me from the evil spirits on the bus. He's like, okay, I get it now. I guess I appreciate it. And then the two of them just took off on their merry way. It wasn't until 3 days later that Zhang realized whatever caused her to have that reaction literally saved his life. And who knows who the men in blue were? Because something happened on that bus, something caused it to vanish and then crash into the reservoir, and everybody dies on board with their necks broken and their bodies decomposed more than they should be. Like, none of that makes any sense. But all Zhang knows is because of that woman, he was still alive. And so Zhang is like a mix between terrified that he was involved in this, but also so thankful that this woman saved his life. But what he did when he put it all together, when he found out about this bus and, what happened on board, the dead bodies and all that, he went to the authorities and he said there were two other people on the bus that were acting so weird, the men in blue, the ones the woman basically warned him about being these evil spirits. And he told the authorities. And whether or not they bought the evil spirit line didn't really matter. What they're being told is there were two people acting strange on the bus before this all happened. And they went out and they looked for the two men in blue. And they never found them. No one has any idea who they were. And so to this day, all the locals all say to never take the last bus ride along Route 375. On a fall afternoon in 1887, a man named Gene Wilson rode his horse next to the Platte River in Wyoming, herding some cattle that were grazing there. Next to him was Gene's dog, who was running along dutifully right behind him and sort of nipping at the cows' heels to keep them in line. So Gene was a ranch hand, and he worked for a ranch in the town of Casper, which was about maybe 10 miles away from where he was right now. And part of Gene's responsibilities was going out and finding lost cattle that wandered too far from the ranch and herding them back to the pasture. So on this particular day, the weather was perfect, it's sunny, it's beautiful, and generally Gene actually really enjoyed this aspect of his job. Like, he liked being out here. But today, even though he should have been like, this is a great day, he just felt really, really tired. He had worked many, many hours up until this point, and he really just wanted to be done and head back home to where he lived with his wife. They had this little house that was sort of tucked away in this secluded area in this valley surrounded by hills. It was like his oasis. Gene and his wife were like absolute best friends, like the very best part of his day. Even on days where he went out and enjoyed his job, still the best part of his day was always returning home and just catching up with his wife over dinner. That was like the thing he looked forward to the most. And so right now it was like he craved just being home and being with his wife. He could not wait. But Gene, he was a diligent guy, and he just continued doing his job. He's trotting along the river, he's herding the cows. And at some point, as he's sort of at this point mindlessly doing his job, because again, he doesn't want to be here anymore, he looks down and he notices his dog is no longer next to him. His dog was always right next to him, helping, doing the herding, and his dog's not there. And so he stopped and he began looking around, and that's when he realized that maybe because he was becoming so mindless doing this job today, that this huge amount of mist had sort of rolled out over the Platte River. Like he hadn't noticed that there was just all this mist. And as he's looking out, seeing this massive cloud of mist, he noticed his dog. And his dog was actually kind of going nuts. The dog had broken off and run to the edge of the Platte River, and it was sort of like barking like mad. And it had been for some time. It was like Gene just hadn't noticed it. And so he's seeing the mist and he's seeing his dog, and he's like, what's going on over here? He can't see anything on the river. This is a usually pretty well-traveled river, but there hadn't been any traffic, no boats or anything. And so it's a quiet day, but it's like he can't see anything out on the river. The dog is just going crazy. And so Gene's like, what's going on? What's out over there? And this is also like very unusual behavior for his dog. Like his dog was very well trained. This is an odd thing for it to be doing. But, Gene's thinking there's got to be a good reason for it. The dog wouldn't do this for no reason. And so Gene, he lets the cattle just continue making their way along the river, but he, on his horse, he turns and begins making his way over to the dog, who again is sort of stationary by the river's edge, barking and looking out at something in the middle of this mist, presumably. However, as Gene trotted his way towards the dog, the horse began to react to something. Gene's horse began to react to something that Gene couldn't even see. It started to get really scared. It was whinnying and sort of unwilling to go any further. And then finally, when Gene really tried to get the horse to carry on here, the horse actually reared onto its back legs and almost kicked Gene off of it. Gene managed to hold on, and when the horse came back down on all fours, he just calmed the horse down and brought it over to a nearby tree. The whole time the dog is still barking like crazy, looking at something out over the water. And so now Gene's like, what is going on here? He gets off his horse and he ties it to a tree, and then on foot, he walks over to his dog. And so he walks over to his dog's yapping and barking, and as soon as Gene is next to his dog stops barking, but it continues to be really fixated on the water, which again is utterly covered by mist. He can't see anything out on the water. It's quiet, eerily quiet. The mist is almost obscuring the sunlight at this point. It's almost like they're inside of a cloud, and it's just him and his dog. The dog is fixated on something, and Gene's looking out over the water, and then all of a sudden it was like the mist began to part, and this enormous, way bigger than he had ever seen on the Platte River, this huge wooden ship suddenly comes into view. And so right away, Gene is sort of baffled by the ship. Number one, it seemed fairly obvious that this is the thing that his dog was barking at. And it might have been the same thing that the horse was reacting to, but Gene's like, why? There are ships that go up and down this river all the time. The dog, the horse, they don't react this way to any of those ships. What's that about? But more than that, this ship really was just enormous. Looked out of place. It was so big. And this is not a particularly deep river. And so Gene's like, how is this big of a ship here? And so Gene's almost fascinated with what he's looking at. He's sort of not really worried about the dog anymore, or the horse, or even his cattle. He's looking at the ship, wondering what in the heck it's doing here. Whose ship is this? And so Gene continues to watch as the ship, continues just slowly making its way down Platte River. And as he's staring at it, again, just sort of fascinated by it, he counts 9 sailors on the deck, moving around, doing something on the deck. But what they were doing on the deck just wasn't immediately clear. They weren't doing sort of obvious sailor things. They were clearly working on something in unison on the deck. There was something they were doing all together. There was this apparent huge tarp almost that sat in the middle of the deck of the ship, and they were sort of moving it around, and it appeared like there was something underneath it, but Gene couldn't see it, and he was too far away to make out what it could be. And so Gene is he's staring at this crew, he's looking at the ship, and then all of a sudden, all 9 of the sailors on board the ship, almost like in unison, just stopped what they were doing and they turned. And they all, at the exact same time, just stared directly at Gene. And it sort of like disarmed Gene. Like he was really, staring intently at them. It was like alarming to have them all be looking at him all at once. And so he's sort of taken aback and he's looking out at them like, are they looking at me? What did I do? What's going on here? And then all at once, these 9 people, they go back to what they're doing and they begin to lift up this tarp, right? So they're revealing what's underneath it. And now, Gene, he's both terrified and sort of confused and still just fascinated. And he's looking out like, what are they going to reveal? Like, this is so weird. And the tarp comes up. And at first, all Gene could see was like this weird mound, like a black mound sitting on the deck of the ship that was underneath this tarp. But as he continued to stare, he suddenly realized what he was looking at, it couldn't be possible. Like, how could that be out? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And he was horrified. He was scared, and he's thinking like, I don't even know what to do. And all of a sudden, he grabs his dog, he runs back to his horse, and he thinks, I have to get home. I have to get home right now. And so on his horse he goes, he just gets his dog, he abandons the cattle. From what he's seen, he doesn't even care. He has to make sure that everything back home is okay. And he takes off. He starts galloping as fast as he can back in the direction of that quaint little home he's got down in the hillside. And so over an hour of riding, basically at full tilt, he finally crests the hill. And by this point, he's tried to convince himself that what he saw on board that ship could not have been a real thing. But he goes up the hill that looks down into the valley where he would normally first see his home. Except when he looked down into the valley, his home wasn't there anymore. His home was just this smoldering black ruin. The home had burned down, apparently in the last few hours while he was gone. And so Gene is a mixture of horrified, but also weirdly not surprised, and he blazes down the hill. He gets to what remains of his home. And he sees that's not all. He sees there is a black mound that looked just like the mound he saw on board that ship that is laying on the ground not far from where his house was. And it's the body of his wife. That's what he saw out on the ship. He saw the dead body of his wife burned and destroyed, but it was definitely her. He could make her out from here. It scared him so bad he went back to check, and now he's seeing it in real life. Now, of course, for all you folks who are hearing this story, you're going to think, come on, like this happened in the 1800s. Like, how much of this is really true? What, he looked out and he saw a ghost ship appear with a premonition or a vision of his wife who he's going to find dead? Sure, right? Well, listen to this. So after Gene finds his dead wife, he has this incredible story about how he sort of knew about it beforehand by seeing this ghost ship, if you will. And so he went and told people. He told a lot of people about what happened. And eventually, a few years later, his story found its way to a journalist named Vincent Gaddis. And Vincent Gaddis happened to have done all this extensive reporting about the infamous Bermuda Triangle, which is just off the coast of Bermuda. There's this section of the ocean where all this very strange activity has been reported over many, many years, like stuff that is basically paranormal in nature consistently is reported in this part of the world. And so he had done a lot of research on the Bermuda Triangle. And so he's primed to hear stories like Gene's story and take them seriously. And so when he heard about Gene's story, he began looking into it. And Vincent pretty much immediately discovered that there was absolutely no record of this enormous ship being on the Platte River. In fact, as Vincent found, it would have been impossible for a ship of that size, as Gene described, this 100-foot ship, being able to travel on the Platte River. It was too shallow. So there was no record, and it seemed impossible. And so the way Vincent responded to this is, okay, well, clearly, Gene is a man who's been racked by guilt and shame. He feels probably like he somehow let his wife down by going out that day, and she winds up dying in this fire. And so this is a man who's just dealing with grief. And it's his grief that has somehow created this story in his mind to explain what happened to his wife. You know, it seems crazy, but people do crazy things when they are really deeply affected by grief. However, many years later, that same journalist wound up finding out that actually Gene was not the only person who had a story like this. He discovered that apparently 25 years before Gene's story, and then 16 years after Gene's story, there were these two other people who specifically reported seeing this enormous ship on the Platte River that apparently had the dead body of one of their loved ones on board, and like all the sailors are looking out at them and they're like showing them this dead body, but that person that they're seeing was alive as far as these people thought. But then when they went home, they discovered that their loved ones were in fact dead. It was the same as Gene's story. In the years since these sightings, this ship has become known as the Death Ship, and it's widely considered to be a death omen both in the Platte River Valley and also throughout Wyoming.
A passenger sitting in seat 12B rested his head against the cold plastic of the cabin wall and closed his eyes. The steady hum of the jet engines was acting like a lullaby, and he was just starting to drift off to sleep. But then he heard a loud metallic click from the aisle right next to him. He opened his eyes and saw a man standing there holding a dark green explosive device. The man had just pulled the pin out, and he was raising it above his head while screaming at the top of his lungs. But before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that is of interest to you, please invite the like button over for a nice relaxing dinner, and then accidentally spill an entire pot of boiling hot soup directly into their lap. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you do not miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let us get into today's story. On the morning of May 8th, 1972, the bustling terminal of the Vienna International Airport was filled with the usual sounds of travelers dragging heavy luggage and the low murmur of announcements echoing overhead. Captain Reginald Levy walked through the concourse with a slight spring in his step. He adjusted his dark uniform jacket and smiled at a passing flight attendant. He had a small smile on his face as he thought about his 50th birthday tomorrow. Reginald had spent thousands of hours in the air and had flown all over the globe. The route from Vienna to Tel Aviv was one he knew like the back of his hand. On this specific trip, his wife was actually sitting back in the cabin. She had packed a bag and decided to tag along so they could celebrate his big milestone birthday together the moment they got off the plane. He reached the gate and walked down the jet bridge, feeling the familiar rush of cool air as he stepped onto the massive aircraft. The plane was a Boeing 707 operated by Sabena Airlines as Flight 571. Back in the cabin, 90 passengers were slowly finding their seats and shoving their coats into the overhead compartments. The flight attendants were moving up and down the narrow aisles, helping people get settled and handing out small cups of water. It was just the normal organized chaos of boarding a commercial flight. Near the back 4, passengers were sitting quietly by themselves. Once everyone was buckled in, the heavy cabin doors were shut and locked. Reginald pushed the throttles forward and the jet taxied out to the runway. Minutes later, the plane roared down the asphalt and lifted up into the sky. The seatbelt sign turned off with a soft ding, and the flight attendants immediately brought out the drink carts. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries began to fill the cabin as people unbuckled their harnesses and stretched their legs. Reginald always liked to stretch his legs once they reached cruising altitude. So he handed the controls over to his co-pilot, opened the cockpit door, and walked out into the first-class section. He made his way down the long, narrow aisle toward the back of the plane. He stopped every few rows to chat with the passengers, asking them where they were headed and cracking a few mild jokes. He stopped to give his wife a quick kiss on the cheek before continuing his rounds. The flight was completely normal for the first hour. People were finishing their meals, and the flight attendants were coming back through to collect the plastic trays and empty cups. The steady drone of the 4 jet engines provided a constant background noise that made it hard to hear conversations more than a few rows away. But suddenly, that steady noise was shattered by the sound of loud shouting coming from the back galley. Reginald turned around just in time to see 2 men and 2 women rushing forward. They were the 4 passengers who had been sitting quietly near the back during boarding. but now they were holding handguns and explosives. One of the men grabbed a flight attendant by the arm and shoved her against the bulkhead. The passengers started shouting and ducking down in their seats as the attackers ran straight down the aisle toward the front of the plane. Reginald tried to block their path, but one of the men aimed a pistol directly at his chest and ordered him to get back into the cockpit. Reginald backed away slowly, keeping his hands up. He stepped through the cockpit door, and the two male attackers followed right behind him, locking the door from the inside. The female attackers stayed out in the main cabin, waving their weapons and shouting at everyone to keep their heads down and not to move a single muscle. Inside the tiny cockpit, the leader of the group shoved his gun against Reginald's head and told him that they were taking full control of the aircraft right at that exact moment. The man demanded that Reginald change course and fly the plane directly to Lod Airport in Israel. Reginald knew trying to fight back with a gun to his head would be a fatal mistake. So he just nodded, sat back down in his chair, and slowly adjusted the navigation instruments. He keyed his radio and quietly broadcast an emergency code to the air traffic controllers on the ground, letting them know that Flight 571 had been compromised by armed individuals. For the next several hours, the plane flew through the sky while the passengers sat completely frozen in their seats. The women guarding the cabin walked up and down the aisles, randomly pointing their weapons at people and threatening them if they made any sudden movements. Nobody was allowed to get up to use the restroom. Nobody was allowed to speak. They just sat there with their hands in their laps, staring straight ahead at the plastic seatbacks in front of them, listening to the drone of the engine. Eventually, the coastline of Israel appeared in the distance. The attackers grew visibly tense as they approached Lod Airport. Reginald began the descent, bringing the massive jet down lower and lower until the wheels hit the tarmac with a hard thud. He applied the brakes and brought the plane to a complete stop on an isolated stretch of the runway far away from the main terminal. The engines were shut down, and the sudden lack of background noise inside the cabin felt incredibly heavy and suffocating. Outside on the runway, the Israeli military and local police were already setting up a massive perimeter. Armored vehicles and dozens of armed soldiers surrounded the aircraft from a distance. The intense Middle Eastern sun was beating down on the metal fuselage of the plane, and because the engines were off, the air conditioning had completely stopped working. The temperature inside the cabin rapidly climbed, turning the metal tube into an absolute oven. Passengers were sweating profusely and gasping for air. The attackers opened a line of communication with the control tower. The leader picked up the radio and stated their demands very clearly. They wanted the immediate release of hundreds of their imprisoned comrades currently held in Israeli jails. They said if their demands were not met, they would detonate the explosives and destroy the entire aircraft with everyone still trapped inside. The negotiators on the ground tried to keep the man talking, asking clarifying questions, and pretending to consider the terms. Hours dragged by, and the heat inside the plane became unbearable. Several passengers fainted from dehydration and slid out of their seats onto the floor. Reginald tried to reason with the attackers, asking them to at least let the women and children go or to allow some fresh air into the cabin, but they completely ignored him. They paced back and forth, looking out the small windows at the military vehicles. The negotiators kept stalling, saying they needed more time to gather the prisoners. As the sun began to set, the situation reached a breaking point. The attackers were getting incredibly frustrated by the constant delays. They told the tower that they were done waiting and that they were going to start executing passengers if they did not see some real movement soon. The negotiators begged them to hold off, saying that the prisoners were being transported, but that the plane was in no condition to fly them anywhere. They pointed out that the aircraft had a severe mechanical issue from the landing. The ground control team told the attackers that the plane's hydraulic fluid had leaked out during the landing. They said that even if the prisoners arrived, the plane would not be able to take off again unless the hydraulic lines were repaired. The attackers were suspicious, but they knew they needed the plane to function if they were going to escape. They looked out the window and saw a dark puddle forming on the tarmac under the wing, totally unaware that soldiers had intentionally spilled liquid there. Reluctantly, the leader agreed to let a small team of mechanics approach the aircraft to fix the leak. But he warned that if he saw any military personnel or any sudden moves, he would blow the plane to pieces. A few minutes later, a group of men wearing heavy white mechanic coveralls emerged from a building near the terminal. They were pushing a couple of large metal equipment carts and walking very slowly toward the aircraft. The attackers watched them closely, their fingers resting on the triggers of their weapons. The mechanics reached the plane and started inspecting the landing gear. The passengers could hear metal tools clanking against the fuselage. The female attackers in the cabin ordered everyone to put their heads between their knees and not look out the windows. The mechanics seemed to be taking a very long time, checking different valves and hoses and constantly whispering to each other. The leader in the cockpit was getting impatient and demanded that they hurry up and finish the job. But the men down on the tarmac were not actually there to fix any hydraulic lines. Based on declassified operation archives and witness accounts, here is a reconstruction of what happened next. The man wearing the oversized white coveralls crouched behind the wheel of the aircraft and took a deep, steadying breath. Sweat was pouring down his face, partly from the intense heat of the tarmac, but mostly from the massive adrenaline spike coursing through his veins. He looked at the other men standing around the cart. They were all waiting for the exact right moment. He reached his hand inside the large front pocket of his coveralls and wrapped his fingers around the cold steel grip of a small suppressed firearm. He knew the layout of the Boeing 707 like the back of his hand. They had spent the last several hours practicing this exact maneuver on an identical plane hidden in a hangar on the other side of the airport. Every single step had been rehearsed until it was completely automatic. He nodded to the man across from him. They simultaneously reached into the metal equipment cart and pulled out several more weapons, concealing them beneath their bulky white sleeves. They slowly stepped away from the landing gear and began walking toward the wings of the plane. They had to act completely casual, like they were just moving to check another valve. They could feel the eyes of the people inside the plane tracking their every movement through the small oval windows above them. He reached the designated position near the emergency exit over the wing. The other men had moved to the main cabin doors. He placed his hand flat against the warm metal of the fuselage and waited for the signal. His heart was pounding so hard against his ribs that he thought the people inside might actually be able to hear it. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, visualizing the narrow aisle and the specific seats where the targets were standing. Then he heard a sharp whistle cut through the quiet air. He immediately ripped the zipper of his coveralls down, completely discarding the disguise. He grabbed the emergency exit handle and yanked the heavy door entirely out of its frame. He tossed it onto the wing and vaulted through the opening, diving headfirst into the stifling heat of the cabin. The sudden noise of the door being ripped open caused the attackers to spin around in shock. But before they could even raise their weapons, he was already up on his feet and leveling his firearm directly at them. The narrow fuselage instantly erupted into deafening chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the dim cabin as the men who had just been posing as mechanics swarmed the aircraft from multiple entry points. Passengers screamed and curled up into tight balls on the floor, trying to make themselves as small as possible. He fired 2 quick shots, neutralizing the first target, and then immediately pivoted to face the front of the plane. The air was instantly thick with gray smoke and the smell of burnt gunpowder. The entire assault lasted less than 2 minutes. When the heavy echoing of the gunshots finally stopped, an absolute silence settled over the cabin. He stood in the middle of the aisle, breathing heavily and scanning the rows of seats for any remaining threats. He lowered his weapon and called out a clear code word confirming that the cabin was fully secured. The other men shouted back from the front and rear galleys. The immediate danger was finally over. The men began helping the passengers up from the floor. The doors were pushed wide open and fresh evening air finally flooded into the sweltering cabin. Reginald emerged from the cockpit looking completely stunned but entirely unharmed. He wrapped his arms around his wife and held her tightly in the middle of the aisle. All 90 passengers survived the ordeal. The tactical ambush had neutralized all the threats without triggering a single explosive device. The men in the white coveralls secured the area and began guiding people down the emergency slides to the tarmac. Those mechanics were actually highly trained operators from an elite commando unit known as Sayeret Matkal. 2 of the young men who stormed the plane that day in their white coveralls would actually go on to become prime ministers of their country, Ehud Barak and Benjamin Netanyahu. They had pulled off one of the most flawless hostage rescues in modern aviation history, relying entirely on the element of surprise and a completely fabricated mechanical leak to get inside the airplane. It is jarring how quickly a completely normal environment can be flipped upside down by an unexpected threat. One moment you are sitting in a comfortable seat, and the next you are staring at a loaded weapon. In this case, the danger came from above, dropping into the lives of the passengers from the sky. The intense standoff on the Israeli runway was finally over, and the empty shell of the Boeing 707 was left completely silent as the passengers were taken away to safety. But a very different kind of silence was already waiting across the globe. It was not the silence that follows a loud and chaotic rescue mission on an international airport runway, and it did not involve heavily armed military commandos or explosive devices. Instead, this silence was hidden in the dark, waiting patiently inside a small apartment in Arizona, where a single microscopic trace would remain perfectly preserved for 30 years until the truth finally came entirely out of the shadows. On a Wednesday evening in early January of 1971, 21-year-old Dina Bowden sat on the floor of her apartment in Tempe, Arizona. She was a senior at Arizona State University, and her living room was completely covered in thick textbooks, highlighters, and loose sheets of lined paper. Dina had a major exam coming up, and so she had spent the entire afternoon reviewing her notes. She lived alone in a small one-bedroom unit in a complex called Villas East, which was situated just a short walk from the university campus. The apartment was nothing fancy, just standard off-campus student housing with thin walls and a small kitchen that looked out toward the street. Around 6 o'clock, Deanna took a break from her studying and walked into the kitchen to make some dinner. She opened the fridge, pulled out some leftovers, and stood by the counter eating while listening to the faint sounds of her neighbors through the walls. She could hear a television playing a game show in the apartment next door and the sound of a car engine turning over out in the parking lot. Tempe in the winter was usually pretty mild, and the desert air cooling off outside made the apartment feel a little bit stuffy. So Dina walked over to the front door and cracked the window right next to it to let some fresh air inside. A little while later, Deanna's boyfriend came over. They had planned to spend the evening together just hanging out and taking a break from the stress of classes. He arrived around 7:30, knocking lightly on the door before Dina let him in. They sat on the small couch in her living room talking about their schedules for the upcoming week and listening to a few records on her turntable. They had a really good relationship, very steady and very normal. They talked about their plans after graduation, their families, and the usual things college students worry about. By about 10:30, her boyfriend said he needed to head back to his own place because he had an early morning class the next day. Dina walked him to the front door, they hugged, and they made plans to meet up again the following afternoon. He walked down the concrete steps of the apartment complex, got into his car, and drove away. Deanna locked the door behind him, or at least she thought she did, and went back to her books for another hour or so. Around midnight, she gathered up her papers, stacked them neatly on the coffee table, turned off the living room lights, and went into her bedroom to go to sleep. She changed into her nightclothes, climbed into bed, and turned off the small lamp on her nightstand. The apartment was completely dark and quiet. The next morning, Thursday, January 7th, Deanna's boyfriend woke up and went to his morning classes. After he was done around noon, he drove back over to Villas East to meet up with Deanna like they had planned. He walked up the concrete steps to her apartment and knocked on the door. He waited a few moments, but there was no answer. He knocked again, a little bit harder, this time calling out her name. Still, nothing. He knew she didn't have any classes that afternoon, so she was supposed to be home. He reached out and turned the doorknob. It clicked, and the door swung open. He stepped inside and called out for her again. The living room looked exactly the same as it had when he left the night before. The textbooks were still stacked on the coffee table. The kitchen counter was clear, but there was a heavy metallic smell in the air that he couldn't quite identify. He walked past the kitchen and turned down the short hallway that led to her bedroom. The bedroom door was slightly open. He pushed it wide and looked inside. The mattress was completely soaked in dark, thick blood. Deanna was lying on the bed and she was not moving. The room was completely upended. The lamp from the nightstand was on the floor, and the bedding was tangled and pulled halfway off the mattress. He backed out of the room, his hands shaking, and immediately ran out of the apartment to find a phone and call the police. Within 10 minutes, patrol cars from the Tempe Police Department pulled into the parking lot of Villas East. Uniformed officers taped off the walkway, and detectives in suits walked into the apartment. The lead investigator stepped into the bedroom and took a long look around. Deanna had been stabbed multiple times. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, indicating she had fought back hard against whoever came into her room. The detectives carefully stepped around the blood on the floor looking for a weapon, but there was no knife left behind. They checked the windows and the front door. There were no pry marks on the doorframe, and the glass on the windows was completely intact. The locks were not broken. Whoever did this had either picked the lock, used a key, or simply walked in through an unlocked door. The detectives went door to door in the apartment complex, knocking on every single unit to ask the neighbors if they had heard or seen anything unusual during the night. One neighbor, who lived in the apartment directly below Deanna's, said he had been awake reading a book around 2 in the morning. He told detectives that he heard a loud thump coming from the ceiling right about where Deanna's bedroom would be. He said it sounded like a heavy piece of furniture being dropped, or maybe someone falling out of bed. But after that single thump, there was complete silence. He didn't hear any screaming, any running footsteps, or any doors slamming. He just went back to reading his book. Another neighbor across the hall said she thought she heard a car drive out of the parking lot a little bit later, but couldn't provide a make or model. The detectives brought Dina's boyfriend down to the police station. In any homicide investigation, the person who discovers the body and the romantic partner are always the very first suspects. They sat him down in an interrogation room and questioned him for several hours. They asked him to walk them through every single minute of his evening with Dina. They checked his hands and arms for scratches or cuts, but his skin was completely clear. They also sent officers to speak with his roommates. His roommates confirmed that he had come home right around 10:45 the night before and had gone straight to bed, and he was there the entire night until he left for his morning classes. His alibi was rock solid. The detectives crossed him off the list. Next, they looked into Deanna's classmates and friends. They interviewed guys from her study groups, people she had dated in the past, and anyone who might have had a grievance with her. They found one guy from her history class who had asked her out a few weeks prior and had been rejected. When the police showed up at his apartment, he was sweating profusely and acting incredibly nervous. The detectives thought they had their man. They brought him in and grilled him. But it turned out he was only acting nervous because he had a large amount of illegal narcotics hidden under his mattress and thought the police were there for a drug bust. Once they verified his whereabouts for the night of January 6th, he was completely cleared of the murder. The investigation was hitting a brick wall. The detectives had no weapon, no forced entry, no witnesses, and no obvious motive. Deanna was not involved in anything illegal. She didn't have any enemies. It seemed like a completely random, senseless act of violence. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, the crime scene technicians were carefully bagging up the sheets, Deanna's clothing, and every item in the bedroom. They took it all back to the forensics lab to be analyzed. Now, you have to remember, this was 1971. Forensic science was very limited. They could look for fingerprints and they could test for blood types, but that was essentially it. While examining Deanna's nightclothes under a microscope, a lab technician found something. It was a microscopic trace of biological evidence, specifically a tiny spot of semen. It was the only physical trace the killer had left behind. But in 1971, DNA testing did not exist. The best the technicians could do was determine the basic blood type of the person who left it, which matched a huge percentage of the general population. It wasn't enough to point to any specific individual. The lead detective looked at the tiny fabric swab in the evidence room. He knew they couldn't do anything with it right now. But instead of just throwing it in a cardboard box, he carefully placed the swab into a sterile glass vial, sealed it, and placed it inside a deep freezer in the evidence lockup. He hoped that maybe someday science would figure out a way to use it. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. The Tempe Police Department exhausted every single lead. They followed up on hundreds of tips, but none of them panned out. The cardboard boxes containing Dina Bowden's case files were moved to the back of the records room. The detectives who originally worked the case grew older, packed up their desks, and retired. New detectives came in, looked at the dusty boxes, and shook their heads. The city of Tempe grew larger. Arizona State University expanded, tearing down old buildings and putting up new ones. A decade passed, then 2 decades, then almost 3. Deanna's family continued to call the police station every year on the anniversary of her death, but the answer was always the same. There was nothing new. Then, in the year 2001, exactly 30 years after Deanna was killed, the Tempe Police Department formed a dedicated cold case unit. A team of new detectives went down into the archives and started pulling out the oldest, most difficult, unsolved murders. They opened the cardboard box with Dina's name on it. They read through the typed reports from 1971, reviewing the interviews with the boyfriend and the neighbors. One of the detectives walked down to the evidence deep freezer. He dug through the old frost-covered bins until he found the small glass vial that had been sealed 3 decades earlier. Inside was the tiny fabric swab. By 2001, forensic technology had completely transformed. DNA testing was now the gold standard of criminal investigations. The detectives sent the vial to the state crime lab. The scientists carefully extracted the biological material from the fabric. Because it had been kept frozen, the sample was perfectly preserved. They were able to extract a complete, clean DNA profile of the man who had left it behind. The lab technicians took that genetic sequence and uploaded it into CODIS, the national DNA database that stores the genetic profiles of convicted offenders from all over the country. They hit enter, and the computer started comparing the sequence against millions of others. It took a little while, but eventually the system pinged. It was a perfect 100% match. The name on the screen was Clarence Wayne Dixon. The cold case detectives immediately pulled up Clarence Wayne Dixon's criminal record. He had an extensive file including convictions for assault and other violent crimes committed in the 1980s and 90s. He was actually already sitting in a prison cell for a completely different offense. But the detectives needed to know how he connected to Deanna Bowden in 1971. They pulled his background file and looked at his last known addresses. They scrolled back through the years, going all the way back to January of 1971. When they saw the address where he was living at the time, the detectives just stared at the paper in total silence. In 1971, Clarence Wayne Dixon was not some drifter passing through town. He was a 15-year-old high school student. And his family's house was located directly across the street from Dina's apartment complex at Villas East. Based on Maricopa County Superior Court transcripts, forensic analysis, and police records, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the night of January 6, 1971. The 15-year-old boy sat by the window in his bedroom looking out across the dark, quiet street. He had been watching the apartment complex for a long time. He knew the schedules of the college students who lived there. He watched the cars pull in and out of the parking lot. Earlier that evening, he had watched the boyfriend's car pull up to the curb, and he watched the boyfriend walk up the concrete stairs. He sat there in the dark, waiting. Around 10:30, he saw the front door open. He watched the boyfriend walk back down the stairs, get into his car, and drive away. He kept his eyes fixed on the window of the apartment. He saw the living room lights turn off. A few minutes later, he saw the faint glow of the bedroom lamp turn off. He waited for a few hours just to be absolutely sure the street was completely empty. Around 2 in the morning, he quietly slipped out the front door of his house. He walked down his driveway, his shoes making no sound on the pavement. He crossed the 2-lane street, stepping into the shadows of the Villas East parking lot. He walked up the concrete steps to the second floor, stopping right in front of her door. He reached out and wrapped his hand around the doorknob. He turned it slowly. It didn't catch. The lock hadn't been fully engaged. He pushed the door open just an inch, listening to the silence inside. He slipped through the crack and closed the door softly behind him. He stood in the dark living room, letting his eyes adjust. He could smell the faint scent of the dinner she had cooked earlier. He walked past the coffee table, stepping carefully to avoid knocking into the stacks of textbooks. He turned down the short hallway. The bedroom door was open. He stepped inside. He moved toward the bed, gripping the handle of the weapon he had brought with him. When it was over, he stood in the bedroom, breathing heavily. He dropped the lamp on the floor, leaving the room in complete disarray. He turned around, walked back down the hallway, and slipped out the front door, pulling it shut behind him. He walked down the concrete steps, crossed the dark street, and went right back into his own house. He went to his bedroom, washed his hands, and went to sleep. A few hours later, the sun came up. He walked out onto his front porch and sat down. He watched the boyfriend's car pull up. He watched the boyfriend run down the stairs a few minutes later, looking panicked. And then he just sat there on his porch, drinking a soda, as the patrol cars with flashing lights swarmed the apartment complex. He watched the detectives carrying their notepads. He watched them knock on doors and interview people. He just sat across the street in broad daylight, watching them try to figure out a puzzle that he had created, knowing they had absolutely no idea that the answer was a teenager sitting right in front of them. 30 years later, the microscopic trace of evidence finally caught up to him. Clarence Wayne Dixon was formally charged with the murder of Deanna Bowden. He was pulled from his existing prison cell, put on trial, and convicted. He spent the rest of his life behind bars for a crime he thought he had completely gotten away with just by walking across the street. But sometimes a criminal hiding in plain sight doesn't involve sitting quietly on a porch while the police investigate. Sometimes hiding in plain sight requires a loud engine, a fresh coat of paint, and a group of maximum security prison guards literally saluting you as you fly away into the sky. On a Sunday evening in mid-August of 1971, a 55-year-old man named Joel sat on the edge of his cot. The air inside his concrete cell was heavy and thick with the late summer humidity. Sweat dripped down the back of his neck as he stared at the peeling paint on the wall opposite his bed. He listened to the faint, metallic sound of guards walking down the corridor, their heavy boots scuffing the floor. He was inside the Santa Marta Acatitla maximum security prison in Mexico City. Joel was serving a 28-year sentence for a murder conviction that he constantly fought against. He was a wealthy businessman from New York who had inherited a massive molasses empire completely out of place in this incredibly harsh environment. He did not speak the language well, and he spent his days avoiding the brutal politics of the cell blocks. He had been locked inside these massive concrete walls for several years, watching his life slowly slip away. He knew he would die in this facility if he stayed. Joel stood up from his cot and walked over to the heavy iron bars of his cell. He looked down the long, dimly lit corridor. It was Sunday evening, and in this particular penitentiary, Sunday evening meant only one thing for the inmates. It was movie night. This was the single most important event of the entire week for the men locked inside. The large auditorium at the center of the prison was opened up, and hundreds of men shuffled out of their cell blocks to gather in the dark room. They sat on wooden benches and stared at the flickering light of the projector screen. It was also the most relaxed time for the prison staff. The guards knew that almost every single inmate was contained in one room, sitting quietly in the dark. Because the routine was so predictable, the guards would lean against the walls, share matches to light their cigarettes, and let their guard down. They would watch the movie right along with the prisoners, their rifles resting lazily by their sides. Joel knew that routines created blind spots, and he had spent years studying every single blind spot in Santa Marta Acatitla. Joel stepped out of his cell, but he did not join the long line of men heading toward the auditorium. He walked up to a passing guard holding his stomach and told the man he had an awful ache and just wanted to get some fresh air. The guard barely looked at him, just nodded his head and waved him through toward the exterior doors. Joel walked out into the main recreation yard. The yard was an enormous square of packed dirt and concrete, completely surrounded by towering walls topped with thick coils of razor wire. There were guard towers at every single corner of the perimeter. Inside those high towers, armed men stood watch holding high-powered rifles. They looked down at the yard, tracking any movement below. Joel kept his head down. He kicked a small rock across the dirt and slowly paced in a small circle. The sun was starting to set, casting long, dark shadows across the prison yard. The sky was turning a deep shade of orange and purple. Joel stopped pacing. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He looked down at his watch, and then he looked up at the sky. He stood completely still in the center of the massive empty courtyard. The only sound was the faint, muffled audio of the movie playing from the auditorium building behind him. But then Joel heard something else. It was a low, rhythmic thumping sound. The sound was coming from the south, echoing over the dense urban neighborhoods of Mexico City. It got louder and faster with every passing second. The sound vibrated in Joel's chest, a heavy mechanical chopping that cut through the humid air. Up in the towers, the guards stopped leaning against the railings. They stood up straight and gripped their rifles. They stepped up to the edge of the towers and looked out at the horizon. A helicopter was approaching the prison. It was flying incredibly low and moving very fast directly toward the eastern wall. The guards tracked the approaching aircraft through the iron sights of their rifles. Their fingers rested on the triggers preparing to fire at the unauthorized vehicle. But as the helicopter banked hard to the left, the setting sun illuminated the side of the fuselage. The guards clearly saw a very distinct paint job. The helicopter was painted in a specific shade of dark blue and white. It featured exact striping and a highly detailed official seal on the door. It was the exact color scheme of the Mexican Attorney General's personal fleet of aircraft. The guards immediately lowered their rifles. The Attorney General was one of the most powerful government officials in the entire country. The guards assumed this was an unannounced, highly classified surprise inspection by the top brass. They quickly buttoned up their uniform shirts and adjusted their posture. They stood perfectly rigid inside the towers, wanting to make a good impression. As the helicopter hovered directly over the prison courtyard, the armed guards raised their hands to their foreheads in a crisp, respectful salute. The helicopter began to descend. The massive downdraft from the rotor blades kicked up a violent sandstorm in the yard. Dirt, loose papers, and trash flew everywhere, completely blinding anyone trying to look directly at the aircraft. The skids of the helicopter hit the concrete with a loud scrape. The passenger door was shoved open from the inside. Joel did not hesitate for a single second. He put his head down against the flying debris and sprinted across the yard. He ducked under the spinning rotors, grabbed the metal frame of the doorway, and hauled himself into the passenger seat. He slammed the door shut. The engine whined loudly, and the helicopter shot straight up into the darkening sky. The aircraft easily cleared the razor wire and disappeared over the horizon, blending into the twilight. Down in the yard, the dust slowly began to settle. The guards were still standing in the towers, their hands still glued to their foreheads. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors of the auditorium burst open. The warden ran out into the yard. He was red in the face, screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding to know where the helicopter went and who exactly was inside it. The guards lowered their hands. They looked down at the completely empty yard. They looked over at the screaming warden. A sickening realization washed over them. They did not just salute the Attorney General, they just saluted a fleeing prisoner. The entire prison immediately went into a total lockdown. Sirens began wailing across the facility, cutting through the quiet Sunday evening. Searchlights were turned on, sweeping frantically across the empty sky. The Mexican federal police were called in to secure the perimeter. Investigators swarmed the prison yard. They interrogated the guards, who kept repeating that the aircraft absolutely belonged to the government and had the official seal on the door. The investigators quickly checked the official flight logs for the Attorney General's fleet. Every single government helicopter was accounted for sitting safely inside their hangars across the city. The aircraft that landed in the prison was a complete fake. The authorities were entirely baffled by the sheer audacity of the operation. A helicopter is not something a person can just buy anonymously and hide in a garage. It requires pilots, specialized mechanics, aviation fuel, and a massive amount of coordination. They interrogated the other inmates, but nobody knew anything. They only knew that Joel had a lot of money and a lot of connections on the outside. Based on historical records from the Mexican Federal Police and verified accounts, here is a reconstruction of what happened in the months leading up to that Sunday evening. A man walked into a private aviation hangar in a small, dusty town in Texas. He was carrying a heavy canvas duffel bag. He found the owner of the hangar and pointed to a used Bell 47 helicopter sitting quietly in the back corner. He opened the duffel bag and dumped thousands of dollars in cash onto a metal workbench. He purchased the helicopter right there on the spot, completely off the books. A few days later, he hired a highly specialized private aircraft mechanic. He handed the mechanic a stack of color photographs showing the helicopters used by the Mexican government. He told the mechanic to completely strip the Bell 47 and repaint it. He needed the blue paint to match absolutely perfectly. He demanded the white stripes be the exact same width as the official fleet. He even provided a custom decal that perfectly mirrored the government seal. While the helicopter was being painted, the man sat at a table covered in massive blueprints. He had bribed a city clerk to get the original architectural drawings of the prison. He studied the heights of the walls. He calculated the exact square footage of the main courtyard. He determined the Bell 47 would barely fit. The rotor diameter would clear the massive walls by just a few feet on either side. It would be an incredibly tight fit, requiring a perfectly vertical drop and a flawlessly vertical climb. He also paid off a guard to smuggle a small two-way radio into the prison. Over several weeks, he and the prisoner worked out the exact timing. They needed a moment when the yard was totally empty. The Sunday night movie was the only viable option. They picked August 18th at exactly 6:30 in the evening. On the day of the flight, the man took off from a remote dirt strip near the border. The Bell 47 did not have the fuel capacity to fly all the way to the city and back, so he had previously buried drums of aviation fuel in the desert. He landed in a dry riverbed, pumped the fuel from the rusty barrels by hand, and took off again. He flew low, skimming the tops of the trees and weaving through the canyons to stay completely below the radar. He did not file any flight plan. He reached the outskirts of the city as the sun was going down. He navigated entirely by looking at the highways below. Then he saw the massive concrete walls of the penitentiary standing out against the surrounding urban neighborhoods. His hands gripped the controls tightly. He knew there were armed guards in every single tower. If his paint job was slightly off, or if one guard got trigger happy, they would shoot his fragile glass helicopter directly out of the sky. He pushed the stick forward and accelerated toward the prison. He flew directly over the wall. He looked out the side window and saw the guards tracking him with their weapons. He held his breath and brought the helicopter into a steady hover. He watched the guards closely. He saw them lower their rifles. He saw them stand at attention and proudly salute him. He let out a sharp breath, dropped the collective control, and slammed the helicopter down hard onto the concrete. He threw the passenger door open. He watched the prisoner run across the yard and jump inside. He immediately pulled up on the controls, pushed the throttle to the absolute maximum, and the helicopter climbed vertically out of the prison. The helicopter flew north for about an hour before landing on a small, hidden dirt airstrip in a neighboring state. Sitting on the runway was a twin-engine Cessna airplane, fully fueled and waiting patiently with its engines currently running. The two men left the fake government helicopter sitting in the dirt, climbed into the Cessna, and took off toward the border. By the time the Mexican federal police figured out what had happened, the plane had safely crossed into the United States. Joel Kaplan, the incarcerated millionaire, had used his massive personal fortune to hire a professional smuggler named Vic Statter to completely bypass the walls of a maximum security prison. It remains one of the most meticulously planned escapes in penal history, and Joel lived the rest of his life as a free man. Pulling off a successful escape using a loud machine dropping from the sky requires an incredible amount of money planning and a whole lot of noise. It is a very deliberate, chaotic, and heavily funded disruption of an established routine. But sometimes a disruption to a normal routine does not come from a roaring engine or a massive, elaborate scheme. Sometimes it comes from someone who is already there, standing completely silently in the dark woods, watching people sleep inside a canvas tent. On the evening of Friday, May 12, 1972, 16-year-old Veikko stood behind a borrowed sedan in the town of Hyvinkää, Finland, shoving a large green canvas tent into the trunk. His two best friends, Isa and Kaija, who were also 16, were tossing sleeping bags and a heavy plastic cooler into the back seat. The three teenagers had just finished their final exams for the week, and they had been planning this camping trip for over a month. They slammed the doors shut, rolled the windows all the way down to let the mild spring air in, and drove out of the town limits. Veikko kept his hands loosely on the steering wheel, while Esa leaned forward from the passenger seat, constantly twisting the dial on the dashboard radio, trying to find a station that didn't have static. Kaija sat in the back, leaning her elbow on the window frame, watching the paved roads slowly turn into packed dirt and gravel. They were heading toward the Kaitaja Manor estate. It was a massive, sprawling area of forests, open fields, and deep lakes. The land was entirely privately owned, but because the property was so vast and unfenced in many areas, locals from the surrounding towns frequently drove out there to hike or pitch a tent near the water. After driving for about 45 minutes, Veikko steered the sedan off the main dirt road and followed a narrow pair of tire ruts through a thick line of tall pine trees. He parked the car in a small clearing where the trees broke, revealing a wide, flat expanse of grass that sloped gently down toward the edge of a dark lake. The sun was just starting to set, casting long, thin shadows across the water. The teenagers popped the trunk and began hauling their gear out. They carried the heavy canvas tent down to the grass near the water and dumped it on the ground. For the next 20 minutes, they struggled to put the tent up. The aluminum poles kept slipping out of the metal grommets, and at one point, Isa accidentally dropped one of the main support rods into a patch of wet mud. Kaija laughed and threw a handful of dry grass at him. Eventually, they managed to get the structure standing. They drove heavy metal stakes into the soil with a rock to secure the corners, and then they unrolled their 3 sleeping bags inside, laying them side by side on the thin floor of the tent. Once the camp was set up, Veikko walked along the edge of the tree line, gathering dry birch bark and snapped branches. He piled the wood inside a ring of small stones near the water, struck a match, and dropped it into the center. The bark caught, immediately sending a thin column of gray smoke up into the evening air. The three of them pulled a fallen log closer to the fire and sat down. They opened the cooler, pulled out a package of sausages, and pushed long wooden sticks through the meat to roast them over the open flames. They sat there for hours eating their food and drinking glass bottles of soda. They talked about their grades, the teachers they disliked, and their plans for finding part-time jobs during the upcoming summer break. Essa talked at length about saving up enough money to buy a used motorcycle he had seen parked behind a mechanic's shop in town. Kaija complained about the mosquito bites she was already getting on her ankles, swatting at the air with her empty soda bottle. Around midnight, the fire had burned down to a pile of glowing orange coals. The air coming off the lake was getting significantly colder, and the teenagers were all pulling their jackets tightly around their shoulders. Veiko stood up, stretched his arms, and poured the remaining water from his canteen over the coals. The embers hissed loudly and went completely dark. The three teenagers crawled through the fabric flap of the tent and zipped the door shut behind them. The space inside was very cramped, and they had to lie perfectly straight to fit. They wiggled into their sleeping bags, zipped them up to their chins, and stared up at the dark canvas ceiling. They listened to the frogs croaking in the reeds and the crickets in the grass, and slowly they all drifted off to sleep. The next morning, May 13th, a local man from a nearby town was out walking his dog along a public dirt path that bordered the far edge of the estate. The sun had been up for a few hours, and the air was getting warm. As the man walked, his dog suddenly stopped, dug its paws into the dirt, and began pulling hard on the leather leash. The dog was staring down the sloping hill toward the lake, whining softly. The man pulled the leash, trying to get the dog to keep walking, but the animal refused to move. The man followed the dog's gaze down the hill and saw the green canvas tent sitting in the grass near the water. It looked a bit strange. One side of the tent was sagging heavily, as if one of the aluminum poles had snapped or fallen over. The man figured some teenagers had come out to party the night before and had just left a mess behind. He decided to walk down the hill to see if they had left any trash that his dog might try to eat. As he got closer to the clearing, the man noticed there were no voices. The borrowed sedan was still parked up by the tree line, but there was no movement outside the tent. When he stepped into the grass a few yards away from the campsite, a thick swarm of large black flies buzzed heavily in the air. The man stopped walking. He looked closely at the side of the green canvas tent. There were several large, dark, wet stains soaking directly through the fabric from the inside out. The man cleared his throat and called out, asking if anyone was awake inside. There was absolutely no response. He took 2 steps closer, reached out, and grabbed the metal zipper of the tent flap. He pulled it up just a few inches and looked inside. He immediately dropped the zipper, turned around, grabbed his dog by the collar, and sprinted back up the hill as fast as he could to find a telephone. Within an hour, multiple cruisers from the local police department and the National Bureau of Investigation bounced down the rutted dirt road and parked in the clearing. Detectives got out unspooled rolls of yellow tape and strung it between the pine trees to block off the entire area. The lead detective walked down the grassy slope, pulling on a pair of tight latex gloves. He stepped up to the tent, unzipped the flap all the way, and pulled the fabric back. The 3 teenagers were still lying inside their sleeping bags. They had all been shot directly in the head. The interior of the tent was saturated with blood pooling on the thin nylon floor and soaking completely through the sleeping bags. The detective crouched down and looked for any signs of a struggle. There were no defensive wounds on their hands. The sleeping bags were not torn or twisted. It appeared they had all been shot while they were completely asleep, likely never even waking up. The detective backed away from the tent and began to inspect the rest of the campsite. He looked at the cooler. It was closed. He saw Veiko's leather wallet sitting on a flat rock right next to the ashes of the fire, with several paper bills sticking out of it. He looked closely at Kaija's body inside the tent and saw a silver necklace resting perfectly intact around her neck. The keys to the sedan were sitting right on the fallen log. The detective realized immediately that this was not a robbery. Whoever came down to this lake in the middle of the night did not want money or jewelry. They just wanted to kill the people inside the tent. The detective called his team over and ordered them to fan out into the surrounding woods. They formed a long line and walked slowly through the tall grass looking for footprints, discarded weapons, or tire tracks. About 10 yards away from the tent, sitting in the damp grass, an officer found 3 empty brass shell casings. The detective walked over and picked one up with a pair of tweezers. It was a large caliber casing, the kind used in high-powered scoped hunting rifles. It was an incredibly precise weapon, not the kind of cheap handgun typically used in a street robbery. The police immediately started looking into the locals. The Kaitaja Manor estate was vast, and there were always rumors of transients or poachers living illegally in the deep woods. A patrol officer reported that there was a transient man who lived in a rusted-out van about 5 miles away from the lake. This man was known to set illegal animal traps on the estate and had been chased off by locals with sticks multiple times. The detectives drove their unmarked cars out to the coordinates the officer provided. They found the van parked under a thick canopy of trees. The transient man was sitting on an overturned plastic bucket cooking beans over a small kerosene stove. The detectives approached him with their hands resting on their holstered weapons. They searched the van top to bottom. They found a rusted double-barrel shotgun hidden under a mattress, but they did not find a hunting rifle. They brought the man into the station and sat him in a small, brightly lit interrogation room. The man was sweating profusely and his hands shook as he lit a cigarette. He swore he had never been down by the lake. The detectives pressed him on his whereabouts for the night of May 12th. The man stated that he had been drinking at a local tavern in the center of town from 8 in the evening until closing time at 2 in the morning. Detectives drove to the tavern, showed the bartender a photograph of the transient man, and the bartender confirmed the alibi. The man had been sitting on a stool drinking beer the entire night. The timeline completely ruled him out. The investigators shifted their focus to the victims' personal lives. They interviewed the teenagers' families and their classmates at the local high school. During one interview, a girl from Kaija's math class mentioned that Kaija had recently rejected a boy from their school who had been relentlessly asking her out for months. The friend noted that this boy had a notoriously bad temper, frequently got into shouting matches in the hallways, and was an avid hunter who spent weekends shooting with his father. Detectives drove to the high school, walked down the linoleum hallway, and pulled the boy out of his chemistry class. They sat him down in the principal's office. The boy crossed his arms tightly across his chest and immediately took a defensive posture. He admitted that he was extremely angry when he found out Kaija had gone camping with Veiko and Essa, but he adamantly denied following them. The detectives left the school and drove directly to the boy's house. They knocked on the door, showed their badges to his parents, and asked to inspect the family's gun cabinet. The father unlocked the wooden display case in the living room. The detectives pulled out the hunting rifles and inspected the barrels. There was a thin layer of dust inside the metal tubes, indicating they had not been fired in a very long time. Furthermore, the boy's parents confirmed that he had been in his bedroom playing music until he fell asleep, and they had been awake in the living room the entire night. There was no way he could have slipped out. It was another complete dead end. The lead detective sat at his desk at the precinct, staring at the photographs of the green tent and the brass shell casings. He thought about the physical location of the crime. The Kaitaja Manor estate was heavily isolated. A random person walking through the woods at night with a high-powered hunting rifle made no sense. But the detectives suddenly remembered the long history of complaints filed at the precinct regarding that specific property. The estate was owned by a very wealthy, prominent billionaire. For years, the dispatch logs were full of angry phone calls from the owner of the manor, constantly complaining about teenagers, hikers, and fishermen trespassing on his land. The owner demanded that police drive out and arrest anyone who stepped foot on his grass, exhibiting an intense, paranoid hatred of outsiders. He treated the vast wilderness as his own personal kingdom. The detective decided to drive out to the manor house himself. He steered his car up the long, perfectly paved driveway, passing through tall iron gates. The manor was an opulent, massive stone building surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. The detective knocked on the heavy wooden front door. The owner opened it wearing a tailored suit, looking down his nose at the officer. The detective asked if the owner had heard any loud noises or gunshots down by the lake on the night of May 12th. The owner waved his hand dismissively, stating he slept very soundly in the center of his large home and heard nothing. But as the owner stepped back to close the door, the detective noticed a massive, ornate glass gun cabinet standing in the hallway. It was filled with high-end scoped hunting rifles. The detective asked if he could inspect the firearms. The owner's jaw tightened, his posture became rigid, and he demanded the detective leave his property immediately. The detective left, but he immediately returned to a judge to secure a search warrant for the estate. Based on the National Bureau of Investigation reports, forensic ballistics analysis, and later court transcripts, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the night of May 12th. He sat in a high-backed leather chair in his massive, dimly lit study on the second floor of the manor. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a grandfather clock. He swirled a glass of liquor in his hand, looking out the large bay window over his property. He owned thousands of acres. He owned the dirt, the trees, the lake, and every blade of grass. As he stared out into the darkness, his eyes caught a faint, flickering orange glow in the distance right by the edge of the water. He stood up and pressed his hand against the cold glass of the window. It was a campfire. Someone was down there. Someone had driven onto his land, walked across his grass, and decided to build a fire without his permission. A hot, suffocating surge of anger completely filled his chest. People had absolutely no respect. They treated his historic, expensive estate like it was a public park. He decided he was not going to call the police this time. He was going to handle the trespassers himself. He walked out of the study and marched down the long carpeted hallway. He took a small brass key from his pocket and unlocked the heavy glass doors of his gun cabinet. He reached past several shotguns and pulled out a heavy bolt-action hunting rifle equipped with a magnified optic. He opened a small wooden drawer at the bottom of the cabinet, grabbed a handful of large brass cartridges, and shoved them into his coat pocket. He pulled the bolt of the rifle back, pressed the cartridges into the internal magazine one by one, and pushed the bolt forward with a sharp metallic click, chambering a live round. He opened the front door of the manor and stepped out into the cold night air. He did not bring a flashlight. He knew every single inch of his property by heart. The damp grass brushed heavily against his leather boots as he walked down the long sloping hill toward the tree line. The walk took him roughly 20 minutes. He moved in complete silence, keeping his eyes entirely fixed on the fading orange glow of the embers. He reached the edge of the pine trees and stopped. He stood in the deep shadows, looking at the small green canvas tent sitting just a few yards away. The fire had died down to coals. He stood perfectly still and listened. He could hear the faint, steady sound of breathing coming from inside the fabric walls. The trespassers were asleep, just lying there comfortable on his property. He raised the heavy wooden stock of the hunting rifle to his shoulder. He pressed his cheek against the wood and looked through the magnified glass of the scope. He aimed directly at the center of the dark green canvas mass. He placed his finger on the curved metal trigger and pulled. The deafening crack of the rifle completely shattered the silence of the lake. The heavy bullet ripped through the fabric. He instantly reached up, grabbed the metal bolt, pulled it back, and ejected the smoking brass casing into the wet grass. He slammed the bolt forward, loading a second round. He adjusted his aim slightly to the left, targeting another lump, pressing against the canvas, and pulled the trigger again. He cycled the bolt a third time, ejecting another casing aimed at the right side of the tent, and fired a third shot. He lowered the smoking rifle. The ringing in his ears slowly faded, replaced once again by the sound of the frogs in the reeds. He waited. Nothing moved inside the tent. There were no voices. He turned around, carrying the heavy rifle by his side, and walked slowly back up the long hill. He entered his massive stone house, wiped the moisture off the barrel with a cloth, locked the weapon back in the cabinet, took off his boots, and went to sleep in his bed. The man who fired those shots into the tent was Veijo Voutilainen, the eccentric billionaire owner of the Kataja Manor. When investigators executed their search warrant and confiscated his collection of hunting rifles, ballistic experts matched the firing pin impressions and the barrel rifling perfectly to the 3 brass shell casings found in the grass, the lake. When presented with the forensic evidence, Veijo Voutilainen finally confessed to pulling the trigger. However, he told the detectives that he was only trying to shoot blindly into the dark to scare the campers away, insisting that the fact that all 3 teenagers were struck directly in the head was just a tragic, completely unforeseeable accident. But forensic crime scene analysts proved that the trajectory of the bullets meant the shots were fired from a very close distance with absolute deadly precision directly into the sleeping forms. In 1972, Veijo Voutilainen was arrested, put on trial, and convicted. The wealthy landowner had genuinely believed that his property lines gave him the absolute right to act as an executioner for the crime of trespassing on his grass. A sudden, violent disruption of sleep inside a thin canvas tent out in the open wilderness is entirely jarring, but at least the woods provide countless directions to run if you actually have the chance to wake up. But sometimes a sudden disruption of sleep does not happen under the trees. Sometimes it happens inside a massive building made of thick concrete and heavy iron bars where running away is entirely impossible, and the people pointing the weapons at you are the exact same people who were hired by the state to guard. The doors. In mid-August of 1972, 28-year-old Carlos Astudillo was sitting on a thin mattress inside his cell at the Rawson Penitentiary. This massive concrete facility was located in the desolate, windswept region of Patagonia, Argentina. The winter wind constantly whipped against the exterior walls, forcing frost through the gaps in the small window frames. Carlos pulled a wool blanket tightly around his shoulders, listening to the heavy boots of a guard walking outside. Carlos had been transferred to Rawson 6 months earlier. The journey there had been a grueling 2-day drive in the back of an unheated transport truck. He remembered the heavy iron gates of the penitentiary closing behind him. The military had specifically chosen this facility because it was located hundreds of miles away from the capital city of Buenos Aires. They operated on the assumption that out here in the frozen wasteland, the prisoners would be completely cut off from the world. Carlos shared this cell block with dozens of other political prisoners. The daily routine was strictly enforced and painfully monotonous. They were woken up before dawn, fed a small portion of stale bread and cold coffee, and then assigned to various work details. Carlos usually worked in the laundry area. The air there was thick with the smell of harsh bleach and damp cotton. He would spend hours pushing heavy carts of wet uniforms back and forth across the cracked tile floor. The guards rarely spoke to the prisoners unless they were shouting orders. They carried heavy wooden batons and were quick to use them if someone stepped out of line. Carlos had learned to keep his head down and his eyes fixed on the floor. But despite the strict surveillance, the prisoners had developed their own silent language. A slight nod, a hand gesture while folding a sheet or a sequence of taps on the plumbing pipes could communicate complex messages across the entire facility. On the morning of August 15th, Carlos was sitting in the mess hall, picking at a bowl of thin soup. He looked across the long metal table and made brief eye contact with a man named Marcos. Marcos simply blinked twice and slowly wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Carlos felt his heart rate suddenly spike, but he forced his face to remain completely expressionless. He picked up his spoon and continued eating his soup. That specific hand gesture meant the plan was moving forward. For months, the prisoners had been secretly coordinating a massive, unprecedented breakout. They had studied the exact timing of the guard patrols and the shift changes. They knew exactly how many seconds it took for the main gate to open and close. The plan involved over 100 inmates moving in perfect synchronization to overpower the guards without firing a single weapon. Carlos finished his soup, stood up, and carried his plastic tray to the washing station, his hands trembling. At exactly 6:30 in the evening, the shift change began. A group of prisoners carrying heavy laundry bags approached the main control room. As the guards opened the steel door to inspect the bags, the prisoners suddenly dropped the laundry and lunged forward. They pinned the guards to the floor and quickly stripped them of their uniforms and keys. Within seconds, other inmates were unlocking the cell blocks and flooding the corridors. The takeover happened in a matter of moments. Carlos stepped out of his cell and joined the wave of men moving toward the exit. The leaders of the breakout, wearing the stolen guard uniforms, easily bypassed the final security checkpoints. They walked out into the freezing Patagonian night and signaled to several transport trucks that were waiting on the dirt road outside. The first group of inmates sprinted across the frozen ground, climbed into the back of the trucks, and immediately sped off toward the Trelew airport a few miles away. Carlos was part of the second group. They were supposed to follow right behind the leaders in a series of stolen cars. But there was a miscommunication in the courtyard. The cars were parked further away than anticipated, and several inmates struggled to get the engines started in the freezing temperatures. By the time Carlos and 18 other prisoners finally piled into the vehicles and tore down the dirt road toward the airport, they had lost several critical minutes in the process. When Carlos's car skidded to a halt in front of the small airport terminal, the engines of a commercial passenger plane were already roaring. The first group of escapees had successfully hijacked an Austral Airlines jet. Carlos jumped out of his car and sprinted across the tarmac, the freezing wind biting at his face. But as he reached the chain-link fence, the massive jet began rolling down the runway. He stood there, panting heavily, watching the red lights disappear into the night sky. Carlos and the remaining 18 escapees were completely stranded. They quickly retreated inside the small airport terminal and barricaded the glass doors with luggage carts and heavy wooden benches. It did not take long for the local authorities to realize what had happened. Within 20 minutes, the airport was entirely surrounded by heavily armed military personnel. Armored vehicles blocked the runway, and soldiers carrying assault rifles took up positions behind the concrete pillars. The temperature inside the terminal began to drop rapidly as the heating system was shut off from the outside. Carlos walked over to the large floor-to-ceiling windows and peered out into the darkness. He could see the silhouettes of snipers taking up positions on the roof of the neighboring hangars. Red laser sights occasionally cut through the falling snow, landing squarely on the glass just inches from Carlos's face. The sheer number of troops deployed outside made a breach look imminent. The 19 prisoners sat on the cold linoleum floor of the terminal, quietly discussing their options. They knew that if they engaged in a firefight with the military, they would all be killed. They only had a handful of stolen handguns. The leaders of the group decided that their only chance of survival was to surrender in the most public way possible. They believed that if the entire country was watching them, the military would be forced to follow standard legal procedures. They used the airport telephone to call several local journalists and news stations, demanding that reporters be allowed inside the terminal before they handed over their weapons. Surprisingly, the military commander outside agreed to the terms. A few hours later, a group of reporters carrying large cameras and bright lights walked through the barricaded doors. The prisoners stood in the center of the terminal, bathed in the harsh white light of the television cameras, and officially surrendered. Carlos stood next to a young woman named Maria, holding his hands up in the air as a soldier approached and patted him down. The cameras were flashing continuously, capturing every single movement. The prisoners gave short interviews to the journalists stating their names and confirming that they were unharmed. They explicitly requested to be transferred back to the civilian prison at Rawson, where they had legal representation. The military officers nodded and promised they would be taken there. The 19 prisoners were marched outside into the freezing night and loaded onto a large military bus. Carlos sat by the window, watching the armored vehicles escorting them down the dark highway. But after about 20 minutes, he noticed the bus was turning in the wrong direction. The sign on the side of the road did not say Rawson. It pointed toward the Almirante Czar naval base. Carlos felt a heavy knot form in his stomach. The naval base was strictly military territory. When the bus pulled into the heavily fortified base, the prisoners were immediately separated from the journalists. The flashbulbs and television cameras were gone. Armed Marines shoved Carlos and the others off the bus and marched them down a long, dimly lit concrete corridor. They were stripped of their heavy winter coats and locked inside individual holding cells. The walls were made of damp concrete, and the air was even colder than it had been at the civilian prison. Carlos huddled down. For the next several days, the routine at the naval base was incredibly strict. The Marines forced the prisoners to stand facing the wall for hours at a time without moving. If anyone shifted their weight or dropped their arms, they were struck across the back of the legs with a rifle butt. They were not allowed to speak to each other, and they were given barely enough water to survive. The silence of the naval base was only broken by the sound of military boots echoing in the hallway. Occasionally, a guard would walk down the line of cells and randomly strike the iron bars with his baton, creating a deafening metallic clang that shattered the quiet. The sudden noise was designed to keep the prisoners on edge. Carlos would sit on the freezing floor, wrapping his arms tightly around his knees, trying to preserve whatever body heat he had left. The meals at the naval base were even smaller than at the penitentiary, usually just a cup of lukewarm broth that tasted like rust. Carlos lost track of time in the dark cell. The constant cold and lack of sleep made his mind feel sluggish and heavy. He tried to focus on the fact that their surrender had been televised. The entire country had seen them drop their weapons without a fight. Their families knew exactly where they were. He repeated this to himself over and over again, treating it as an absolute guarantee of his safety. The military could not make 19 famous prisoners disappear without facing public outrage. On the evening of August 21st, the atmosphere in the cell block suddenly shifted. The regular guards were replaced by a new group of Marines who seemed incredibly tense. They paced back and forth down the corridor, their hands resting heavily on their weapons. Carlos stood by the iron bars of his cell, listening to the hushed conversations of the Marines, but he could not make out the words. The lights in the corridor were suddenly dimmed, casting long shadows across the concrete. Around 3:30 in the morning on August 22nd, Carlos was jolted awake by the sound of heavy metal latches clanking loudly. A harsh voice echoed down the corridor, ordering everyone to wake up and step out of their cells immediately. Carlos rubbed his eyes, confused by the sudden commotion. He stood up and walked to the door. A Marine was standing there, pointing a rifle directly at his chest, gesturing for him to move into the hallway. Carlos stepped out into the freezing air. The 18 other prisoners were also standing in the corridor. They were lined up in a single row against the damp concrete wall. Carlos looked to his left and saw Maria standing a few feet away. She looked completely exhausted, her shoulders slumped forward. At the far end of the hallway, a group of high-ranking military officers stood in the shadows. Based on declassified National Commission records and survivor testimonies, here is a reconstruction of what happened next in that corridor. The officer gripped the heavy stock of his submachine gun, his knuckles turning white. He had received his orders directly from the top, and there was absolutely no room for hesitation. He looked down the long corridor at the 19 unarmed prisoners standing against the wall. They were just standing there, shivering in their thin clothes, blinking against the dim light. He knew they thought the television cameras from the airport had saved them. He knew they thought they were protected. He took a step forward, his boots making a sharp clicking sound on the concrete. The other Marines flanking him raised their weapons, waiting for his signal. He did not say a single word. He did not read any charges, and he did not offer any explanations. He simply raised the barrel of his machine gun, aimed it squarely at the chest of the first prisoner in the line, and squeezed the trigger. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire completely shattered the quiet of the naval base. The officer swept the barrel of his weapon from left to right, walking slowly down the hallway as he fired. The other Marines opened fire as well, creating a massive, overlapping wall of bullets that tore into the prisoners. Bodies crumpled against the concrete wall, sliding down to the floor in a chaotic tangle of limbs. The echoing noise of the gunfire was so incredibly loud in the enclosed space that it vibrated heavily in the officer's chest. He continued firing until his gun clicked empty. He lowered his smoking gun and stared down the hallway. The air was thick with gray dust and the heavy metallic smell of copper. The 19 prisoners were piled on the floor, completely motionless. A few of them were still breathing, letting out shallow, ragged gasps. The officer signaled to his men. 2 Marines stepped forward, pulling handguns from their holsters. They walked slowly down the line of bodies, stopping over anyone who was still moving, and fired single shots at close range. The gunfire finally stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the corridor. The officer turned around and walked back toward the administrative offices, leaving the bodies exactly where they fell. A few hours later, the military issued a press release to the national media. The statement claimed that the prisoners at the naval base had orchestrated a violent mutiny, overpowered the guards, and attempted a second mass escape, forcing the Marines to open fire in self-defense. Out of the 19 prisoners lined up in that hallway, 16 were killed instantly, including Carlos Astudillo and Maria Angelica Sibeli. Miraculously, 3 of the prisoners survived the massacre by falling under the bodies of their friends and playing dead until they were eventually transferred to a hospital. Their survival allowed the truth of the execution to eventually reach the public. Following this event, the country plunged into the violent military suppression known as the Dirty War. Those 16 people surrendered under the bright lights of television cameras, completely unarmed, trusting that the public eye would guarantee their safety. But that false sense of security was completely erased in the middle of the night by a firing squad in a hidden concrete hallway. It is jarring how quickly an organized system of authority can turn into a completely lawless execution without any warning. But sometimes a sudden and massive loss of life does not come from a squad of armed soldiers in a dark prison corridor. Sometimes the deadliest force approaches completely silently from the open sky, dropping millions of tons of freezing weight onto a quiet rural town before the people inside even realize they are being buried alive. On the morning of February 3rd, 1972, a 32-year-old farmer named Reza woke up in the small rural village of Sheklabad in northwestern Iran. The air inside his small mud brick house was incredibly cold, and he could literally see his breath turning into small white clouds as he sat up in bed. He pulled a thick, woven blanket tightly around his shoulders and looked over at his wife Miriam, who was still fast asleep. So Reza carefully swung his legs over the edge of the mattress and placed his bare feet on the cold dirt floor. He walked slowly across the single main room of their home, stepping carefully to avoid waking his 5-year-old son Ali, who was sleeping on a small mat near the center of the room. He walked over to a small cast iron stove sitting in the corner, picked up a few dry pieces of chopped wood from a pile, and just tossed them inside. He struck a long wooden match against the stone wall, watching the small flame flare up and cast dancing orange shadows across the room. He dropped the match into the stove, waiting a few moments until the dry bark caught fire and began to crackle. Now Reza closed the heavy iron door of the stove and placed a tin kettle full of water on the flat metal top, knowing it would take at least 20 minutes to boil in this kind of freezing temperature. He poured the boiling water into a small ceramic teapot and dropped a handful of dried black tea leaves into the water, letting the strong, earthy aroma fill the small house. Miriam began to stir on the mattress, rubbing her eyes and sitting up. So Reza smiled at her, poured a cup of the dark steaming tea, and handed it to her as she wrapped a shawl around her head. They drank their tea quietly, just kind of listening to the wind outside. Later that morning, Reza put on his heavy wool coat, wrapped a thick scarf around his neck and lower face, and stepped out the front door. The biting wind immediately stung his cheeks, but he just lowered his head and started walking down the uneven dirt path toward the center of the village. He picked up a few loaves of flatbread from the local baker, noticing that the clouds moving over the mountains looked much darker and heavier than usual. By the time Reza returned to his house, the first few flakes of snow were already beginning to fall. They were small and dry, drifting lazily down from the flat gray sky and landing on the dirt streets. Reza dusted the snow off his shoulders before stepping inside and closing the heavy wooden door behind him. He handed the warm bread to Maryam, who was sitting near the stove, just kind of mending a tear in one of Ali's old wool sweaters. The family spent the rest of the afternoon inside, staying close to the heat of the stove. But as the hours passed, the wind outside began to really pick up, howling loudly as it whipped around the corners of the mud brick houses. Reza occasionally looked out the window and saw that the snow was falling much faster now, the flakes growing larger and sticking to the ground instead of melting. Within just a few hours, the dirt streets were completely covered. When evening came, Reza and Maryam set up the kursi in the center of the room. Now, the kursi was a traditional Iranian piece of furniture, basically a low wooden table with a small charcoal heater placed underneath it. They draped several thick, heavy blankets entirely over the table, allowing the heat to build up and become trapped underneath. The family slid their legs under the table, pulling the heavy blankets up to their waists to keep warm. They ate a simple meal of hot stew and the fresh flatbread, listening to the relentless sound of the wind battering the wooden shutters. Ali was laughing and playing with a few small wooden blocks on top of the table, completely unbothered by the storm outside. Reza and Maryam drank their tea and talked about the repairs the house would need in the summer, entirely assuming that this was just another typical winter storm that would eventually pass. But when Reza woke up the next morning, the sound of the wind was absolutely deafening. It sounded literally like a massive freight train was roaring directly over the roof of the house. He threw off the blankets, walked over to the window, and pushed the wooden shutters open. He immediately stepped back in surprise. The snow had not stopped falling at all. It was piled up nearly 3 feet high against the exterior wall, covering the bottom half of the window. Reza grabbed his heavy coat and boots, knowing he needed to clear the roof before the weight of the wet snow caused the mud brick ceiling to collapse. He pushed the front door open, struggling against the massive snowdrift that had formed against the wood. He grabbed a wide wooden shovel and spent the next 2 hours exhausted and sweating in the freezing air, pushing heavy loads of snow off the flat roof just to keep the structure from buckling. For the remainder of that second day, the family stayed huddled underneath the heavy blankets of the kursi. The temperature outside had plummeted so drastically that even the walls of the mud brick house were radiating a deep, uncomfortable chill. So Reza went out to the woodpile a few times to bring in more fuel, but every single trip required him to dig a deep trench through the rapidly rising snow just to reach the logs sitting against the wall. By the third morning, the situation escalated from a severe winter storm into something entirely unrecognizable. When Reza woke up and looked toward the window, he realized the room was completely pitch black. He walked over and felt the glass. The snow had piled up so high outside that it had entirely buried the window, blocking out every single ray of sunlight. The only source of light inside the house was the dim orange glow of the kerosene lamp. Reza felt a sudden surge of panic in his chest. He walked over to the heavy wooden front door and grabbed the iron handle. He pulled backward, but the door refused to move. The snow had drifted so high against the exterior of the house that the door was completely wedged shut from the outside. Reza shoved his shoulder against the wood with all his strength, but it felt like he was pushing against a solid wall of concrete. They were entirely trapped. Miriam lit another kerosene lamp, her hands shaking slightly as she struck the match. She asked Reza what they were going to do. Reza tried to keep his voice calm, telling her that the storm had to break soon, and once it did, the neighbors would help dig each other out. He took a heavy iron fireplace poker and started carefully chipping away at the edges of the doorframe, hoping to create enough space to pull the wooden door inward. But every time he managed to pry the door open, even a fraction of an inch, a massive pile of freezing snow spilled directly into the living room. The snow was packed incredibly tight, heavy and dense like wet sand. Reza realized that if he opened the door completely, the sheer volume of the snowbank outside would collapse right into the house, burying them and putting out the stove. So he quickly pushed the door shut and engaged the iron latch. Throughout the fourth day, the wind never stopped screaming. It was a constant, terrifying howl that vibrated through the mud brick walls. The family sat underneath the corsi, fully dressed in their thickest winter coats, hats, and gloves. Ali was no longer playing. The young boy was curled into a tight ball against his mother, shivering constantly despite the layers of heavy wool blankets. The temperature inside the room was steadily dropping. By the fifth day, the firewood was completely gone. The cast iron stove was entirely cold, and the small charcoal heater under the corsi had burned down to fine gray ash. The kerosene lamp flickered wildly before the flame finally sputtered out, plunging the small room into absolute total blackness. The air inside the house was so incredibly freezing that it hurt to breathe each inhalation, feeling literally like swallowing tiny shards of broken glass. Reza crawled under the heavy blankets of the corsi, wrapping his arms around his wife and his son. They huddled together in the freezing dark, listening to the deafening roar of the wind outside and the continuous agonizing cracking of the wooden roof beams above their heads. They just lay there, completely isolated from the rest of the world, waiting in total darkness for the relentless storm to finally exhaust itself and pass over the mountains. But the storm was not a normal weather system, and it had absolutely no intention of stopping. Based on World Meteorological Organization, records, regional climate data, and military rescue logs, here is a reconstruction of the unprecedented anomaly that descended upon the region. A massive, slow-moving, low-pressure system had stalled directly over the mountainous terrain, colliding violently with a continuous flow of freezing Arctic air. This atmospheric collision created a localized weather event so incredibly extreme that it completely defied all historical precedent. The clouds did not just drop snow, they unleashed a relentless, suffocating avalanche from the sky. The snowfall rates were so astronomically high that it was impossible for the human residents below to keep up. The white powder accumulated not by inches, but by feet, steadily swallowing the landscape in complete silence. The snow drifted over the dirt roads, then buried the wooden fences, then swallowed the livestock entirely. It climbed up the exterior walls of the mud brick homes, perfectly filling the narrow alleyways between the structures until the village streets ceased to exist. The wind whipped the falling ice into massive towering drifts that reached staggering heights of 26 feet. The weather system was perfectly designed to erase civilization. Beneath the surface of this new white ocean, the enormous weight of the 26 feet of dense packed snow pushed down with thousands of pounds of pressure onto the flat, fragile mud brick roofs. The wooden support beams bowed inward, splintering and fracturing under a load they were never engineered to carry. One by one, in total isolation, the roofs of the buried homes catastrophically collapsed inward, crushing the rooms below without a sound. For 5 continuous days, the Arctic system pulverized the region until it finally spent all its energy. The howling wind eventually died down, the heavy gray clouds fractured and parted, and the bright winter sun finally returned to the sky. But the landscape that the sun illuminated was entirely unrecognizable. It was just a vast, endless plain of blinding white snow, perfectly smooth and completely undisturbed. There were absolutely no buildings. Several days later, a loud, rhythmic chopping sound echoed over the desolate white plains. A heavy military rescue helicopter flew low over the landscape, casting a fast-moving shadow across the snow. The two pilots in the cockpit wore thick aviator glasses to protect their eyes from the intense glare. The navigator sat in the back, holding a highly detailed topographical map of the region, tracing his finger along the contour lines of the mountains. The pilot banked the heavy helicopter in a wide circle, looking down at the ground through the reinforced glass. He keyed his radio microphone and told the navigator that there must be some kind of navigational error. The map indicated that they were hovering directly over a densely populated farming village that was home to several hundred people. But when the pilot looked down, there was absolutely nothing there, except a completely flat field of white. The navigator insisted that the coordinates were perfectly accurate. So the pilot slowed the rotors and brought the helicopter down the heavy skids, settling softly onto the deep snowpack. The engine spooled down, and the deafening roar of the blades slowly faded into a vast, heavy silence. The three men unbuckled their harnesses, grabbed a few heavy metal shovels from the cargo bay, and pushed the side door open, stepping out into the freezing air. They walked a few yards away from the helicopter, looking around in total bewilderment. The pilot drove his metal shovel deep into the snowpack, expecting to hit the frozen dirt of a farm field. Instead, the metal blades struck something hard and solid just a few feet down. The men fell to their knees and began frantically digging with their gloved hands, clearing away the packed ice until they uncovered a broken piece of a wooden ceiling beam. A sickening, terrifying realization washed over the rescue crew. They were not standing in an empty field. They were literally walking directly on top of the village. The houses had not been blown away. They had been completely swallowed. The men immediately started digging with their shovels, carving a deep trench into the 26 feet of snow, desperately trying to reach the interior of the structures below their breath, coming in ragged gasps. When they finally broke through the collapsed ceiling of the first house, they lowered a flashlight into the dark, freezing cavity. The beam of light swept across the destroyed interior, illuminating the crushed furniture, the cold cast-iron stove, and the heavy blankets of a corsi. And underneath those blankets, they found the residents perfectly frozen in place. There was no sign of a struggle, just people who had waited for a rescue that arrived far too late. The military mobilized a massive excavation effort over the next few weeks as the weather briefly thawed. Thousands of soldiers were deployed across the region with heavy digging equipment moving methodically from sector to sector. What they uncovered was a tragedy of unimaginable scale. The village of Sheklabad was not an isolated incident. The unprecedented 26 feet of snow had wiped over 200 entire villages completely off the map. The official death toll from the extreme weather event was staggering. Nearly 4,000 people lost their lives during those 5 days in early February of 1972. It remains officially recorded as the deadliest blizzard in the entire history of human civilization. Thousands of people were completely erased from the world in total silence, buried underneath a freezing white ocean before they even understood the true scale of the danger. It is deeply unsettling how something as quiet and fragile as a falling snowflake can multiply until it possesses enough weight and power to crush entire communities out of existence. There is no negotiation with that kind of elemental force, just a cold, silent suffocation that leaves behind a perfectly calm, undisturbed surface, hiding the immense tragedy that unfolded entirely out of sight. But sometimes, a sudden and completely unexplainable death does not come from a massive, overwhelming act of nature covering hundreds of miles of terrain. Sometimes, an incredible, unexplainable violence is highly targeted, leaving investigators to wonder if what they are looking at was a bizarre accident resulting from sheer incompetence, or an incredibly brilliant, perfectly executed assassination designed to look exactly like one. On a Tuesday evening in early March of 1972, a 45-year-old man named John Giacomo sat at a small, heavily scratched wooden table inside a cramped, completely unheated apartment on the Industrial, outskirts of Milan, Italy. The tiny apartment smelled heavily of old cooking grease, damp plaster, and stale tobacco. The single narrow window in the main room looked out over a dark gray concrete alleyway lined with overflowing trash bins. Gian Giacomo pulled a heavy, worn wool coat tighter around his broad shoulders, desperately trying to block out the freezing draft coming up through the warped wooden floorboards. He reached into his pocket, struck a wooden match against the table, held the small yellow flame to the end of a cigarette, and sat in absolute silence, watching the thick gray smoke drift slowly toward the water-stained, cracked ceiling. Now, Giangiacomo was absolutely not used to living in squalid, freezing places like this. Just a few short years prior, he had been widely recognized as one of the wealthiest, most influential, and most powerful men in all of Western Europe. He was the sole billionaire heir to a massive generational timber and banking fortune, and he had personally used that virtually unlimited money to build an internationally renowned publishing empire from the ground up. He was the incredibly bold man who had famously smuggled the original banned manuscript for the novel Dr. Zhivago out of the Soviet Union and published it to the entire world, cementing his legacy and making him a household name in elite literary circles across the globe. He used to host lavish, endless dinner parties in sprawling historic Italian estates, wearing immaculate custom bespoke suits tailored specifically for his frame, and drinking incredibly expensive rare wine imported directly from the finest vineyards in France. He spent his long, leisurely summers relaxing on massive private yachts in the Mediterranean, and his winters skiing at exclusive high-end luxury chalets in the Swiss Alps. But on this freezing Tuesday night in 1972, his dinner consisted entirely of a hard, stale roll of bread and a small, rusted tin of cold sardines eaten directly from the can with a bent metal fork. Giangiacomo had completely, intentionally, and permanently abandoned his former life of extreme, unmatched luxury. He had voluntarily handed over the operational keys to his vast publishing empire, entirely cut ties with his high society friends, politicians, and business partners, and vanished completely into the dangerous, highly secretive, radical underground movement. He now lived his life entirely off the grid, constantly jumping from one hidden, dilapidated safe house to another, and he exclusively used the fake alias Osvaldo to hide his true identity from the authorities. You see, he spent his long, lonely days writing militant political pamphlets by hand and organizing a highly secretive left-wing paramilitary group. He firmly believed a violent, state-sponsored fascist coup was completely imminent in Italy, and he had decided he was going to fight the government directly from the shadows, trading his fountain pens and tailored suits for heavy boots and explosive charges. Giangiacomo finished his cigarette, pressing the burning stub hard into a cheap tin ashtray sitting in the center of the table. He stood up, pushed his wooden chair back, and walked slowly over to the dark corner of the small room. He reached down and grabbed a heavy dark green canvas duffel bag from the floor, unzipping the top to carefully check the contents inside one last time. Lying at the absolute bottom of the bag were several long coils of thick copper wire, a pair of heavy iron bolt cutters with rusted handles, a thick roll of black electrical tape, a cheap analog timer, and several tightly wrapped heavy bundles of industrial dynamite. He zipped the bag shut, slung the heavy canvas strap tightly over his right shoulder, and walked out the front door, stepping down the concrete stairs and out into the freezing, incredibly dense Milan fog. So Giangiacomo kept his head down and his collar pulled up high around his neck as he walked down the cracked sidewalk carefully, avoiding the bright, direct glow of the few working street lamps. He took a long, highly circuitous route through the city to ensure he was not being followed by any plainclothes police officers or government informants. He boarded a nearly empty public tram, sitting completely silently in the back row, alongside a few exhausted factory workers heading home from their late shifts. He rode the tram for 6 stops, got off at a deserted intersection, and walked for another 2 miles into the rural, heavily industrial suburb of Segrate. He had a very specific, highly strategic target in mind for tonight. Standing alone in an empty, frozen dirt field in Segrate was a massive, towering, high-voltage power transmission pylon. Disabling this specific, critical steel tower with explosives would instantly cause a massive cascading electrical blackout across the entire city of Milan. It was meticulously planned to be a massive show of force, a highly visible demonstration of his group's capabilities, and a clear signal to his underground followers that the revolution was officially underway. The next morning, Wednesday, March 14th, a local dairy farmer woke up in his small stone house just before dawn. He put on a heavy insulated jacket, pulled on his thick rubber work boots, and poured himself a steaming cup of black coffee. He opened his heavy wooden front door and whistled loudly for his hunting dog, stepping out into the thick, freezing gray fog that heavily blanketed his vast rural property in Segrate. The farmer walked slowly and methodically along a packed dirt access path that bordered the massive, overlapping steel legs of the local power pylons, his heavy rubber boots crunching loudly on the thick layer of morning frost covering the grass. As they walked down the path, the hunting dog suddenly stopped walking completely. The thick leather leash pulled completely tight in the farmer's gloved hand. The dog lowered its head, dug its front paws deeply into the dirt, and began to bark aggressively, its hackles raised completely straight up along its spine. The dog was staring directly at a dark, motionless shape lying on the ground near the massive concrete base of the nearest towering steel pylon. The farmer tugged hard on the leather leash, trying to pull the dog forward, but the animal refused to move a single inch, continuing its frantic, panicked barking. The farmer let out a short, frustrated sigh and stepped off the cleared dirt path, wading directly through the tall, freezing wet grass toward the concrete base of the pylon to see exactly what the dog was barking at. As he got closer to the massive steel structure, a very distinct, sharp, highly metallic smell of burnt wire, melted plastic, and scorched earth completely filled the cold morning air. And then the farmer stopped walking entirely, his eyes completely wide. Lying completely flat on the frozen dirt directly beneath the massive steel girders of the power pylon was the heavily mangled, bloody body of a man. The farmer stared at the gruesome scene for just a fraction of a second, immediately turned around, dropped the leather leash entirely, ran all the way back through the wet grass to the main paved road, and frantically flagged down a passing commercial delivery truck driver, begging the man to use his radio to call the local authorities immediately. Within 20 minutes, the quiet rural morning was completely shattered by the wail of sirens. Multiple cruisers from the Italian state police bounced heavily and erratically down the rutted Durio dirt access road, their tires spinning in the mud before parking diagonally near the frozen field. Uniformed officers jumped out of their vehicles, quickly unspooled long rolls of bright yellow caution tape, and cordoned off the entire grassy area surrounding the massive steel pylon. The lead police investigator, a veteran detective wearing a long trench coat, walked slowly through the wet grass, pulled on a pair of latex gloves, and knelt directly beside the body. The physical damage to the man was incredibly extensive and absolute. The man had clearly been caught at the absolute epicenter of a massive close-range explosion. His right leg was completely severed from his body, and there were incredibly deep, dark, black burn marks across his entire torso, his chest, his arms, and his hands. The fabric of his heavy wool coat was shredded into tiny burnt ribbons. The detective stood up slowly and looked around the immediate area surrounding the body. Scattered haphazardly in the dirt within a 10-foot radius were several unexploded sticks of industrial dynamite, a cheap, heavy car battery, a completely broken mechanical timer, several strips of black tape, and a pair of heavily burnt iron wire cutters. The detective leaned back down, reached his gloved hand directly into the interior breast pocket of the dead man's shredded wool coat, and pulled out a singed leather wallet. Inside the wallet was a perfectly forged, highly detailed identification card bearing the completely fake name Vincenzo Maggioni. But when the detective used his thumb to wipe some of the dark soot and dirt away from the man's face, which had miraculously been relatively untouched by the upward trajectory of the blast, he instantly recognized the sharp, aristocratic jawline and the distinct, prominent mustache. The detective's stomach dropped. He had seen this exact face printed on the front pages of newspapers, featured in magazines, and broadcast on national television for years. They carefully loaded the heavily damaged body into the back of an ambulance, transported it directly to the city morgue, and immediately ran the fingerprints through the national database. It took a few hours of processing, but the ink results officially confirmed the detective's initial shocking suspicion. The man lying dead in the dirt was absolutely not Vincenzo Maggioni. It was Giangiacomo Feltrinelli, the globally famous billionaire publisher who had vanished from high society. And so, the Italian police moved incredibly fast to control the narrative. The very next morning, they held a massive, highly publicized press conference packed shoulder to shoulder with shouting reporters and flashing camera bulbs, confidently announcing their definitive findings to the public. The official police report firmly and conclusively stated that Giangiacomo Feltrinelli had died in a botched, completely amateur act of domestic sabotage. The police spokesperson, speaking forcefully into a cluster of microphones, claimed the billionaire, acting out a completely delusional fantasy, as a radical terrorist had attempted to dynamite the power grid all by himself in the dark. According to the official, unwavering police narrative, Feltrinelli was just a wealthy, privileged, completely out-of-touch amateur playing a dangerous game of soldier. They stated on the record that he had completely mishandled the highly sensitive commercial explosives, crossed the wrong electrical wires in the dark, and accidentally blown himself up due to sheer undeniable and fatal incompetence. The police chief closed his folder, stepped away from the podium, and declared the case neatly and officially closed. But the thing is, the investigative journalists and the militant supporters who actually knew Feltrinelli personally immediately pushed back heavily against the official sanitized state story. They managed to acquire leaked high-resolution copies of the original crime scene photographs and the initial forensic autopsy reports, and they began pointing out massive, glaring physical discrepancies that the police had completely and conveniently ignored. Gathering in smoky, crowded newsrooms, reporters analyzed the black and white photos with magnifying glasses, picking apart the physics of the scene. First, the journalists pointed out the highly unnatural, completely illogical placement of the body in the dirt. The crime scene photographs clearly showed Feltrinelli lying perfectly parallel to the massive concrete base of the pylon, with his arms resting neatly and totally straight down by his sides. But an accidental, uncontained explosion of that extreme, concussive magnitude would have violently thrown a human body several yards away through the air, twisting the limbs in completely random, unpredictable, and chaotic directions. A human body absolutely does not neatly arrange itself in a perfectly straight, orderly line immediately after a devastating blast. Second, the journalists pointed to the unexploded dynamite left scattered at the scene. The sticks were wired together in an incredibly amateurish, completely haphazard way, using the wrong type of tape and looping the detonator cords in a chaotic, nonsensical mess. But Feltrinelli was absolutely not an amateur with explosives. He had previously spent months traveling secretly through South America, training extensively and rigorously with highly seasoned, veteran guerrilla fighters in the jungle. He knew exactly how to properly and safely wire basic industrial dynamite for a successful demolition job. Furthermore, the leaked autopsy report noted several deep dark purple contusions and severe bruises on Feltrinelli's wrists and on the back of his head that were completely physically inconsistent with explosive trauma. The bruises looked exactly like the deep friction marks left by tightly bound ropes and the sudden blunt force impact of a heavy solid object striking the skull. These investigative journalists published massive front-page articles arguing that the entire scene at the pylon was completely and meticulously staged from the very beginning. They argued that the billionaire publisher absolutely did not blow himself up by a foolish mistake. They claimed he was specifically targeted and violently assassinated by the Italian Secret Services, dragged completely unconscious to the power pylon in the dead of night, and strapped with his own explosives to purposely make his death look like a humiliating, foolish accident in a deliberate effort to completely discredit his entire political movement. The state police completely ignored these explosive articles, outright refusing to answer any questions from the press or reopen the completely closed case file. Based on Italian State Police historical archives and Corriere della Sera reports, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the night of March 13, 1972. He sat completely still in the driver's seat of a dark, unmarked sedan, parked silently on a completely unlit dirt access road in Segrate. He checked the glowing, luminescent hands of his metal wristwatch. It was just past midnight. The other three men sitting inside the car sat in total, absolute silence, wearing thick black leather gloves and heavy dark woolen coats to block out the freezing air. They were highly trained, state-sponsored covert operatives, and they had been meticulously tracking the billionaire publisher's daily movements for several consecutive weeks. Through a vast, deeply embedded network of paid informants, they knew exactly where he was going, and they knew he was coming to this specific power pylon on this specific night. The driver looked out the front windshield, wiping the condensation from the glass, and saw a faint, dark silhouette walking slowly through the thick gray fog, carrying a heavy canvas bag slung over his shoulder. The driver lifted his gloved hand and tapped the leather steering wheel twice. The three men sitting in the back immediately opened their car doors, stepped out into the freezing wet grass, and moved completely silently through the dark field. They fanned out with perfect military precision, flanking the massive steel pylon from three completely different sides, completely surrounding their target before he even knew they were standing there. They watched intently from the deep shadows as the man dropped his heavy canvas bag onto the wet grass and knelt down in the dirt near the thick concrete base of the tower. One of the covert operatives stepped forward, moving directly right behind the kneeling man. He raised the heavy wooden handle of a solid iron baton high into the air and brought it down with maximum lethal force directly onto the back of the man's skull. The kneeling man collapsed forward immediately, hitting the dirt face first without making a single sound. The other two operatives moved in quickly from the sides. They grabbed the unconscious man's wrists, binding them tightly together with a short piece of rough nylon rope, and dragged his heavy, limp body roughly across the frozen dirt, leaving a long trail in the frost. They pulled him up and propped his back firmly against the cold concrete base of the steel tower. One of the men opened the canvas bag, reached inside, and pulled out the bundles of dynamite, the timer, and the thick copper wire. They worked quickly and incredibly efficiently in the dark, intentionally wiring the explosives entirely incorrectly. They purposely looped the detonator cords in a chaotic, obvious, and sloppy mess to ensure that any police investigator looking at the scene the next day would immediately assume it was the hasty, panicked work of an untrained amateur. They used the thick black tape to secure the main explosive charge directly to the unconscious man's right leg. The driver finally stepped out of the parked sedan, walked slowly across the grass over to the pylon, and looked down critically at the setup. He checked the wiring one last time, ensuring the blast would be highly lethal, but contained just enough to leave the man's face completely intact for immediate and undeniable public identification the following morning. He reached down, pulled the metal pin on the mechanical timer to start the countdown, turned around, and walked briskly back to the car alongside the other three operatives. And so they got inside, rolled up the glass windows, and started the heavy engine. A few short moments later, a massive, deafening, concussive blast completely shook the dirt ground, briefly illuminating the thick gray fog with a bright, violent orange flash that reached high into the sky. The driver shifted the car into gear, pressed the gas pedal down hard, and drove quickly away into the dark night, leaving the completely staged, brutal scene utterly silent behind them. Gian Giacomo Feltrinelli's death was officially recorded by the state as a completely accidental explosion caused exclusively by his own incredibly clumsy amateur mistake. The heavily debated, highly contested police file remained permanently closed, leaving his radical supporters and the investigative journalists with the completely unresolved dark reality of a brilliant state-sponsored assassination, perfectly disguised as a foolish failure. A meticulously planned trap in the dark can completely rewrite a person's entire historical legacy in the blink of an eye, turning a powerful, highly connected billionaire figure into a simple cautionary tale of extreme amateur incompetence. But sometimes, a carefully planned, brutal betrayal in the dead of night does not target a single person walking alone through a freezing, foggy field. Sometimes the most shocking betrayals target a much larger group of people who have already put their hands high in the air, completely trusting the very people who are quietly preparing to pull the trigger. On the morning of October 16, 1972, Thomas Hale Boggs sat in a booth at a small restaurant near the Anchorage airport. He held a thick ceramic mug of black coffee in both hands, letting the heat warm his fingers. Hale was the majority leader of the United States House of Representatives, a very powerful man from Louisiana who was definitely not used to the freezing temperatures of an Alaskan autumn. He was wearing a heavy wool coat over his suit, looking out the window at the gray overcast sky. Across the table from him sat Nick Begich, a much younger man who was the local congressman for the state of Alaska. Nick was very comfortable in the cold. He was talking quickly between bites of his breakfast, going over the schedule for the day. They had a major campaign fundraiser scheduled for that evening in the city of Juneau, which was several hundred miles away. Hale was there to support Nick in his upcoming election, and they needed to get on a plane soon to make it in time for the big dinner. Sitting next to Nick was his 37-year-old aide, Russell Brown, who was flipping through a small notepad and organizing their travel documents. Russell was making sure they had all the right speeches and donor lists ready in his leather briefcase. A few minutes later, a man wearing a heavy leather bomber jacket walked into the restaurant and approached their booth. This was Don Johns, a highly experienced local bush pilot who owned a small air taxi service. Don was very well known around Anchorage for his flying skills and his complete confidence in navigating the rugged Alaskan terrain. He slid into the booth next to Hale and ordered a coffee. Nick asked Don how the weather was looking for the flight down to Juneau. Don took a sip of his coffee and said there was a low-pressure system moving in over the mountains, which meant there would be some heavy clouds and a bit of turbulence, but nothing he couldn't handle. Don explained that his twin-engine plane was more than capable of getting above the worst of the weather, and they would be in Juneau well before the fundraiser started. The four men finished their breakfast, left some cash on the table, and walked out into the biting wind. They drove the short distance to the private aviation tarmac at the Anchorage airport. Parked on the concrete was a Cessna 310, a small but sturdy twin-engine aircraft painted with a bright orange stripe down the side. Don grabbed his pre-flight checklist and began walking around the exterior of the plane, tapping the fuel tanks and checking the wing flaps to make sure the moving parts were not frozen. Hale, Nick, and Russell huddled together near the tail of the plane, pulling their collars up against the freezing wind. Don finished his inspection, opened the small cabin door, and told everyone to climb inside. The interior of the Cessna was very cramped, smelling heavily of aviation fuel and old vinyl upholstery. Hale, being the largest of the men, took the seat right behind the pilot, squeezing his long legs into the narrow space. Nick and Russell sat in the back, placing their briefcases on the floor between their boots. Don climbed into the pilot's seat, pulled the heavy door shut, and locked the latch securely. Don reached forward and flipped several metal toggle switches on the overhead panel. The left engine coughed a few times before roaring to life, sending a heavy vibration right through the floorboards. A few seconds later, the right engine started up, and the noise inside the small cabin became so loud that the men had to shout just to hear each other. Don put on his headset, adjusted the microphone near his mouth, and keyed the radio to speak with the Anchorage Air Traffic Control Tower. He requested clearance to taxi to the runway for a visual flight rules departure heading southeast toward Juneau. The tower controller gave him the green light, and Don pushed the throttles forward. The Cessna rolled down the asphalt, picking up speed as the twin engines whined loudly. Don pulled back on the yoke, and the plane lifted smoothly off the ground, climbing up into the gray morning sky. Inside the cabin, the heater was turned up all the way slowly, blowing warm air onto the passengers' freezing feet. Hale looked out his small oval window, watching the city of Anchorage shrink away as they banked toward the massive snow-covered peaks of the Chugach mountain range. The clouds were sitting very low that morning, blanketing the tops of the mountains in a thick, solid layer of white. Don adjusted his altitude, trying to find a clear path through Portage Pass, a narrow corridor between the jagged peaks that local pilots frequently use to get to the coast. As they flew further into the pass, the clouds around them grew noticeably thicker and darker. The windows of the Cessna started to frost up around the edges, and the small plane began to bounce heavily as it hit pockets of rough, turbulent air. Don kept his eyes locked on his instrument panel, constantly adjusting the yoke to keep the plane level. He did not file a formal flight plan that morning, which was actually a fairly common practice for veteran bush pilots in Alaska who preferred to adjust their routes on the fly depending on the weather conditions. Meanwhile, a few hundred miles away at the Juneau airport, a young campaign staffer named Sarah was standing near a large glass window in the terminal. She was holding a clipboard with the evening schedule printed on it. It was past 11 in the morning, and the Cessna was officially late. She wasn't too worried at first because small planes in Alaska were delayed by weather all the time. But as another hour went by, she walked over to the radio dispatch desk and asked the operator if he had heard anything from Don Johns. The operator leaned over his console, adjusted the dials on his radio, and listened for a moment. He looked up at Sarah and shook his head, saying he had not heard a single transmission from that aircraft since it left Anchorage. By 1 in the afternoon, the minor delay had turned into a serious cause for concern. Sarah started making phone calls to the campaign headquarters, and those people immediately called the local authorities in Anchorage. The Anchorage Tower confirmed that the Cessna had taken off that morning, but had completely vanished from their radar shortly after entering the mountain pass. Because Hale Boggs was one of the highest-ranking political figures in the entire United States government. The news of his missing plane escalated up the chain of command with incredible speed. Within a few hours, the governor of Alaska was notified, and shortly after that, the President of the United States was sitting in the Oval Office receiving an emergency briefing about the situation. The military was immediately ordered to launch a massive search and rescue operation. By the next morning, the Anchorage airport was swarming with United States Coast Guard officers, Air Force pilots, and civilian volunteers. They set up a massive command center in an empty hangar, laying out huge topographical maps of the Alaskan wilderness across folding tables. The search grid they established covered an astonishing 324,000 square miles, which is an area roughly the size of the entire state of Texas. It consisted of jagged vertical mountain peaks, deep frozen valleys, dense pine forests, and freezing ocean waters. A Coast Guard pilot named Jim was one of the first people in the air that morning. He climbed into the cockpit of a massive C-130 Hercules transport plane, which had been modified with large observation windows. The 4 enormous propellers roared as the plane took off and headed toward the Chugach Mountains. The back of the plane was filled with spotters men wrapped in heavy parkas who sat rigidly by the windows holding high-powered binoculars. They stared down at the blinding white landscape below, looking for any sign of orange paint, a plume of dark smoke, or the unnatural straight lines of a broken airplane wing. The conditions for the searchers were absolutely brutal. The temperatures outside the aircraft were well below zero, and the unheated rear section of the military plane was freezing. The spotters had to constantly wipe the condensation off the glass to keep their view clear. The glare from the sun reflecting off the endless snowfields caused severe eye strain, and many of the men had tears streaming down their faces as they forced themselves to keep looking. Jim flew the plane in a tight, methodical grid pattern, banking back and forth over the sharp mountain peaks, flying as low as he safely could without risking a collision with the rock walls. Every few hours, a spotter would suddenly shout over the intercom that they saw something metallic shining down in a ravine. Jim would immediately pull the yoke bank, the heavy plane, sharply and dive down toward the coordinates to get a closer look. The men's hearts would pound against their ribs, thinking they had finally found the crash site. But every single time they got low enough to see clearly, the excitement would completely evaporate. The metallic glint would turn out to be a piece of exposed wet shale reflecting the sunlight, or an abandoned piece of tin roofing from an old trapper's cabin. It was never the Cessna. The search continued day after day without a single piece of viable evidence. The Air Force brought in their most advanced technology to assist in the effort. They deployed SR-71 Blackbird spy planes to fly at the edge of the atmosphere, taking high-resolution, wide-angle photographs of the entire mountain range. Back at the command center, dozens of analysts sat at tables with magnifying glasses, poring over these massive photographs inch by inch, desperately looking for a scorch mark in the snow or a broken tree canopy. They found absolutely nothing. It was as if the Cessna and the 4 men inside had simply evaporated into thin air. The weather over the mountains refused to cooperate frequently, forcing the search planes to stay grounded on the tarmac. Massive blizzards would sweep through the area, dumping several feet of fresh snow over the very same grid squares they had just searched the day before. The rescue commanders knew that if the plane had crashed in the mountains, any debris field or tracks left by survivors would be completely buried and erased by the fresh snowfall. The frustration inside the command center was heavy. The pressure from Washington to find the majority leader was immense, but the Alaskan wilderness simply refused to give up its secrets. After 2 weeks of relentless searching, the operation had grown into the largest and most expensive search and rescue mission in the history of the United States. Over 3,600 individual flight missions had been logged. Dozens of civilian pilots had volunteered their own time and fuel to fly their personal aircraft over the ocean and the forests, hoping to spot a life raft or a signal flare. The military dropped survival caches containing food, heavy blankets, and two-way radios into random clearings across the mountains, hoping that if the men were walking out there, they might stumble upon the supplies. But the radios remained completely silent. By the end of November, the harsh reality of the situation began to settle over the command center. The temperatures in the mountains were regularly dropping to 30 degrees below zero at night. Even if the four men had miraculously survived the initial impact of a plane crash, there was absolutely no way they could have survived for over 30 days in those extreme temperatures without heavy winter gear, shelter, or food. Source: the men flying the search grids knew they were no longer looking for survivors, they were looking for a frozen aluminum tomb. And yet they kept flying, driven by a deep sense of duty to bring the men home to their families. Finally, after 39 continuous days of launching planes and staring at empty white mountains, the military commanders stood in front of the map boards and made an incredibly heavy decision. They had exhausted every single resource available to them. They had covered the entire search grid multiple times from the air and the ground, and they had not found a single drop of aviation oil, a piece of torn vinyl seating, or a scrap of orange metal. The freezing winter storms were making it too dangerous to keep risking the lives of the search crews. The commanders officially issued the order to suspend the massive search operation. Based on historical aviation weather data from that specific day, the known flight characteristics of that particular aircraft model, and standard accident investigation theories from the time here, is a reconstruction of what likely happened to that flight. The pilot sat in his seat with both hands gripping the yoke tightly as the Cessna entered the narrowest part of Portage Pass. The gray clouds around them thickened into a solid, blinding white wall, completely eliminating all visibility. The passengers in the back went completely quiet, gripping the armrests of their seats as the small plane was violently thrown up and down by the massive updrafts coming off the mountain walls. The pilot kept his eyes glued to the artificial horizon gauge on the instrument panel, trusting the dials to tell him which way was up, because his own senses were completely useless in the whiteout. The air temperature outside the plane dropped rapidly as they hit a pocket of freezing rain. The supercooled water droplets slammed against the leading edges of the Cessna's wings and instantly froze solid. This phenomenon, known as structural icing, is incredibly dangerous for small aircraft. A thick, heavy layer of rough white ice began to build up over the smooth aluminum wings, destroying the aerodynamic shape that the plane required to stay in the air. The heavy ice also added hundreds of pounds of dead weight to the aircraft. The pilot pushed the throttles all the way forward, forcing the twin engines to scream at maximum power, but the plane started to feel incredibly sluggish and heavy in his hands. The pilot tried to pull back on the yoke to climb above the freezing clouds, but the ice on the wings had completely ruined the plane's ability to generate lift. A loud, shrill warning horn suddenly blared inside the tiny cabin, indicating that the aircraft was stalling and losing its grip on the air. The nose of the plane dipped downward, and the Cessna began to drop out of the sky like a stone. The pilot pulled back frantically on the controls, fighting against the dead weight of the ice. But there was simply no altitude left to recover. The blinding white clouds outside the windshield suddenly parted for a fraction of a second, revealing the solid, jagged face of a snow-covered mountain directly in front of them. There was no time to turn, no time to brace, and no time to radio for help before the plane slammed violently into the rock and was instantly swallowed by the avalanche of falling snow. On December 29, 1972, a judge in a courtroom officially signed the legal documents declaring all four men on board the aircraft to be legally dead. The massive search had cost millions of dollars and utilized an unprecedented amount of military hardware, but it ultimately failed to provide any closure. Hale Boggs's wife later campaigned for his vacant congressional seat and won, serving in the House of Representatives for many years. Despite countless private expeditions, advanced sonar scans of the nearby lakes, and summer hikers stumbling through those mountains for decades afterward, not a single piece of the Cessna 310 or the men inside it has ever been found. On a freezing Tuesday evening in early November of 1970, an 18-year-old girl named Jolanta stepped off a public tram in the Silesian region of Poland. She pulled her thick wool scarf up over her nose and tucked her bare hands deep into the pockets of her heavy winter coat. Now, the Silesian region at this time was the massive, beating industrial heart of the country. It was an area completely dominated by towering coal mines, massive steel mills, and heavy manufacturing plants. Thick gray smoke constantly poured out of the tall brick chimneys, and the snow on the ground was always covered in a very thin, dark layer of black coal soot. Jolanta started walking down the slushy sidewalk toward her home. The street lamps along the road were dim and flickering, casting long, pale yellow circles on the wet concrete. She walked past several rows of identical gray concrete apartment blocks. She could hear the faint, muffled sound of a television playing through a slightly open window on the second floor and the heavy, rhythmic clanking of a freight train moving slowly on the iron tracks in the distance. She kept her head down, her boots crunching loudly in the snow, just focusing on getting back to her warm apartment so she could take off her heavy boots and eat dinner. She turned down a narrow, unlit pathway that cut between two large residential buildings. The next morning, a man wearing a thick jacket and heavy work boots was walking his dog along that exact same narrow pathway. The sun had just barely come up, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. As he walked, his dog suddenly stopped, dug its paws into the snow, and began pulling hard on the leather leash, sniffing frantically at a large snowdrift near the base of a concrete wall. The man pulled the leash, trying to get the dog to keep moving, but the animal refused. So the man walked over to the snowdrift to see what the dog was looking at. He looked down and he immediately dropped the leash and ran to find a telephone. Within 20 minutes, several dark green police vehicles slid to a halt on the slushy street. Uniformed officers quickly unspooled rolls of heavy rope, tying them between the freezing metal light poles to block off the pathway. A senior detective wearing a long trench coat ducked under the rope and walked slowly toward the snowdrift. He pulled on a pair of leather gloves and crouched down. Jolanta was lying motionless in the snow. The detective examined her closely and noticed very specific, massive blunt force trauma to the back of her head. He also noticed the incredibly specific, deliberate way her belongings had been arranged around her in the snow. The detective stood up slowly, and a heavy, suffocating knot formed in his stomach. This specific method of operation was not new to the local police. For the past 6 years, a serial killer had been stalking the women of the Silesian region. He operated entirely in the dark, targeting women who were walking home alone from the late shifts at the factories or the evening tram stops. He had already killed 13 women before this morning. The local press had given him a name that was repeated in whispers all over the country. They called him the Zagłębie Vampire. The detective leaned back down and reached his gloved hand into the pocket of Jolanta's coat. He pulled out her small folded identification booklet. He opened it up and read her full name, Jolanta Gierek. The detective just stared at the paper for several seconds. He did not say a word to the other officers. He simply turned around, walked briskly back to his vehicle, got inside, and used the two-way radio to call the provincial police chief directly at his private residence. You see, Jolanta was not just a random university student or a factory worker. She was the niece of Edward Gierek, and Edward Gierek was the first secretary of the Polish Communist Party. He was, without question, the single most powerful political figure in the entire country. The man who had been hunting in the shadows of the industrial coal towns had just reached out and murdered a member of the communist royalty. By that afternoon, the local police precinct was completely turned upside down. The federal authorities descended on the region, completely taking over the entire building. The first secretary had personally called the chief of police and made it perfectly clear that the entire resources of the state were to be deployed and the killer was to be found immediately, no matter the cost. The police officially launched the largest, most aggressive dragnet in the history of the country, codenamed Operation Anna. The atmosphere in the region completely shifted overnight. Hardware stores sold out of heavy metal deadbolts and window latches in a single afternoon. Factory managers were forced to completely cancel the third shift operations because absolutely none of the female workers would leave their homes after the sun went down. Men began walking in large groups to and from the tram stations, carrying heavy iron pipes and wooden clubs in their hands. The streets, which were usually bustling with shift workers, were completely empty and silent by 6 in the evening. Inside the police headquarters, the scale of Operation Anna was staggering. The detectives brought in hundreds of folding tables and completely filled the gymnasium and the hallways with massive stacks of paper files. They were attempting to cross-reference the alibis, blood types, and work schedules of nearly every single adult male living in the Silesian region. The government actually purchased a massive early model mainframe computer, which was an incredibly rare and expensive piece of technology in the 1970s, just to process the sheer volume of demographic data. Dozens of clerks sat at small desks, punching small rectangular holes into thick paper cards, feeding them into the massive machine day and night. The machine hummed and clicked constantly, spitting out lists of potential suspects. The state also announced an unprecedented cash reward for any information leading to the capture of the killer. The reward was 1 million zlotys. To put that into perspective, that was the equivalent of a lifetime of wages for an average Polish coal miner. The announcement of this massive fortune caused absolute chaos. The police switchboards were completely overwhelmed. People called in hundreds of times a day, pointing fingers at their neighbors, their coworkers, and people they simply did not like, desperately hoping to get rich. The detectives followed up on every single lead, no matter how ridiculous. They arrested a local butcher because a neighbor reported seeing scratches on his forearms. The police kicked his front door down at 3 in the morning, dragged him out of his bed, and threw him into a holding cell. They interrogated him for 3 straight days before they finally realized he had just gotten scratched while trying to pull a stray cat out of a drain pipe. They completely raided the private clinic of a local doctor who worked odd late-night hours, tearing his office apart and ripping up the floorboards looking for a murder weapon. They found absolutely nothing. Months passed, and the calendar turned to 1971 and then into early 1972. The massive stacks of paper files inside the police headquarters were reaching the ceiling. The air in the precinct smelled constantly of stale coffee sweat and cheap tobacco. The detectives were sleeping on small cots in the basement, entirely exhausted, and the political pressure was reaching a boiling point. The first secretary was demanding a head on a platter to parade in front of the public, and the police chief knew that if they did not produce a guilty man, soon the state would start firing the investigators or worse. Then the police received a tip from a woman who walked into the precinct demanding the 1 million zloty reward. She sat down with the detectives and pointed her finger directly at her estranged husband. She said he was a violent man who worked at a local coal mine, and his daily commuting route occasionally passed through the areas where some of the women had been found. It was an incredibly vague, circumstantial tip, no different from the thousands of other tips they had received over the past 2 years. But the police were completely desperate. They looked at the man's file. He was a completely ordinary, working-class guy. He had no criminal record of extreme violence, he did not own a car, and he lived in a small, cramped apartment. But the detectives drove out to the coal mine, walked right onto the dirt lot, and put him in handcuffs. Based on heavily censored communist-era case files that were reviewed decades later by independent legal experts and historical archives from the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, here is a reconstruction of what happened next. He sat perfectly still on a hard wooden chair in the exact center of a small, windowless concrete room. The air was incredibly thick and heavy with the smell of cigarette smoke. The single overhead light bulb cast a harsh, bright glare that made his eyes water. He had been awake for over 48 hours. His throat was completely dry and his stomach cramped with a sharp, empty pain. He looked down at his hands, which were resting on his knees. They were shaking slightly. 3 men wearing dark suits stood around him. They did not look tired at all. They just stared at him with cold, entirely flat expressions. One of the men stepped forward, holding a thick stack of typed paper. The man dropped the heavy stack onto the small metal table, sitting directly in front of the wooden chair. The sound of the paper hitting the metal echoed loudly in the small room. The man in the suit reached into his inside pocket, pulled out a black ink pen, and placed it on top of the paper. He leaned down, placing his hands flat on the table, bringing his face just a few inches away. He told the man in the chair to pick up the pen. The man in the chair slowly shook his head. He looked at the men in the suits and told them he did not understand. He told them he worked at the mine, he drank at the tavern, and he went to sleep. He asked if he could just go home. A hand grabbed the back of his shirt collar and jerked him violently backward. The wooden legs of the chair scraped loudly against the concrete floor. The man standing behind him leaned down and spoke directly into his ear. He recited the name of a street. He recited the exact time of night. He described a heavy, blunt object. He described the specific way a woman's coat had been folded in the snow. He told the man in the chair to repeat the words back to him. The man in the chair squeezed his eyes shut. He said he did not know those streets. He said he had never owned an object like that. The hand on his collar tightened, cutting off his air for just a few seconds before releasing him. The man in front of the table tapped his finger hard against the stack of typed paper. He said all the words were already written down. All the streets, all the times, all 14 women. He said the first secretary already knew the truth. The man in the chair looked at the black pen sitting on the paper. He thought about his small apartment. He thought about his morning walk to the coal mine. His vision was blurring from the absolute lack of sleep. The constant shouting in the small room was just blending into a solid, deafening wall of noise. The man standing behind him struck him hard across the side of his head with an open palm. A loud, high-pitched ringing sound completely filled his left ear. The man in front of the table pushed the pen closer. He said the questions were never going to stop. He said the light was never going to be turned off. He said the door to this concrete room was locked, and the only key was the black ink inside that pen. The man in the chair let out a long, ragged breath. He slowly lifted his shaking right hand off his knee. He reached out and wrapped his fingers around the cold plastic of the pen. He pulled the thick stack of paper closer to him. He did not read the typed words. He just pressed the tip of the pen against the bottom line of the final page, and he signed his name. The man who signed that confession was Zdzisław Marchwicki, and as soon as his signature was on that paper, the entire machinery of the state kicked into high gear. The police chief called the first secretary to announce they had successfully captured the Zagłębie vampire. The media published his photograph on the front page of every newspaper in the country. The government wanted to make an absolute spectacle out of the conviction. They did not hold his trial in a standard quiet courtroom. They held the trial inside a massive indoor sports arena. The wooden judges' benches were set up directly on the gymnasium floor. The stadium bleachers were completely packed with thousands of angry citizens shouting and jeering as Zdzisław was led into the room surrounded by armed guards. The trial was broadcast heavily on national television. The prosecutors read from the typed confession, ignoring the fact that Zdzisław repeatedly tried to recant his statement, claiming he had been completely forced to sign it. The outcome of the spectacle was entirely predetermined. Zdzisław Marchwicki was found guilty of all 14 murders. Following the highly publicized show trial, he was sentenced to death, and he was subsequently executed. The state closed the files, paid out portions of the reward money, and declared Operation Anna a massive historic success. However, decades later, after the communist government fell, independent legal experts and historical researchers gained access to the heavily guarded censored case files. When they opened the boxes, what they found was entirely deeply disturbing. The forensic evidence collected at the crime scenes absolutely did not match Zdzisław. The blood typing was wrong. The typed confession he had signed in that concrete room was full of glaring geographical errors and inconsistencies that did not match the actual physical locations of the bodies. The researchers realized that the government had likely been fully aware of these massive discrepancies, but the political pressure from the first secretary over the death of his niece was so incredibly intense that the police simply needed a scapegoat to appease their furious leader. They took an ordinary man, broke his spirit in a dark room, and legally executed him just to close the books. The dark, lingering reality of the Zagłębie vampire case is that the real serial killer likely just stopped hunting on his own, leaving an innocent man to take the fall and die in his place. A massive, powerful government apparatus making a deliberate, fatal decision to execute the wrong person in order to cover up a failure is an incredibly heavy tragedy that plays out slowly on the ground. But sometimes a massive, fatal mistake does not happen over the course of a 2-year investigation in a cold police precinct. Sometimes a devastating error happens in a fraction of a second miles up in the open sky, resulting in absolute tragedy for hundreds of people, while the single person responsible for the mistake falls safely back to the Earth. On a Friday afternoon in late July of 1971, a 29-year-old mother named Keiko stood in the crowded, incredibly loud terminal of Chitose Airport in Sapporo, Japan. She shifted her heavy canvas travel bag from her right shoulder to her left, reaching out to grab her young son's hand. The line of passengers moving toward the boarding gate was shuffling forward very slowly, and the enclosed space was completely stifling. She could smell the strong, sharp scent of aviation fuel mixing with the damp wool of the suits of the businessmen standing right in front of her. Her son was constantly tugging on her skirt, holding a small die-cast metal airplane he had just begged her to buy at the airport gift shop. She knelt down on the hard linoleum floor, wiped the sweat off his forehead with a small cloth, and told him they would be boarding the big plane very soon. A few minutes later, Keiko handed her printed paper tickets to a stewardess standing at the end of the narrow jet bridge. The stewardess smiled, checked the seat numbers, and pointed toward the back of the massive Boeing 727. Keiko walked down the long, narrow aisle, keeping her hand firmly on her son's shoulder to keep him from bumping into the other passengers who were shoving their heavy luggage into the overhead compartments. The cabin smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and freshly brewed black coffee. They found their seats in row 25. Keiko let her son take the window seat, watching as he immediately pressed his face completely flat against the thick glass, staring out at the baggage handlers throwing leather suitcases onto the conveyor belts down on the hot asphalt. She sat down next to him, pulled the heavy metal buckle of her seatbelt tightly across her lap, and let out a long breath. Up at the very front of the aircraft, Captain Saburo Kawamoto sat in the left seat of the cramped, instrument-filled cockpit. He was a highly experienced pilot who had logged thousands of hours in the air. He reached forward and flipped several metal toggle switches on the overhead panel, listening to the low, steady whine of the three massive jet engines mounted on the tail of the aircraft spinning up. He pulled a heavy clipboard off the center console and ran his finger down the printed pre-flight checklist, reading the items out loud to his co-pilot, who confirmed every single one with a sharp nod. The weather report for their route from Sapporo down to Tokyo showed completely clear skies and very mild winds. The captain pushed the throttles forward, and the massive commercial airliner slowly taxied away from the terminal, making its way toward the end of the long concrete runway. The Boeing 727 roared down the asphalt, the nose lifting smoothly up into the clear summer sky. The heavy vibration of the wheels rolling against the ground instantly vanished, replaced by the smooth, steady hum of the jet engines pushing the aircraft higher and higher. About 20 minutes into the flight, the captain leveled the plane out at a cruising altitude of 28,000 feet. The seatbelt sign above the passengers turned off with a loud, sharp ding. Immediately, the stewardesses stepped out of the front and rear galleys, pushing heavy metal drink carts slowly down the narrow aisle. They stopped at every row, pouring hot tea and handing out small plastic cups of water and soda. Keiko unbuckled her seatbelt, reached into her canvas bag, and pulled out a small picture book to read to her son. The flight was entirely routine. The passengers were reading newspapers, talking quietly, or just leaning their heads against the plastic cabin walls trying to get some sleep. And then a deafening, massive metallic crunch completely shattered the steady hum of the cabin. It sounded literally like two heavy freight trains colliding directly behind the rear bulkhead. The entire fuselage of the Boeing 727 violently shuddered, throwing the stewardesses completely off their feet and sending the heavy metal drink carts crashing hard into the armrests. The floorboards beneath row 30 buckled upward, violently snapping the heavy metal seat tracks completely in half. Several overhead compartments burst wide open, dumping heavy suitcases directly onto the heads of the passengers below. Instantly, the cabin filled with a blinding thick white fog as the pressurized air was violently sucked out through a massive jagged hole in the tail section. The sudden drop in air pressure caused the small yellow oxygen masks to drop from the ceiling, dangling uselessly at the end of their plastic tubes. Up in the cockpit, the captain was thrown violently forward against his shoulder harness, the steering yoke in his hands completely locked up, refusing to move a single inch Multiple red warning lights instantly illuminated across the entire instrument panel, and a loud, blaring warning horn began screaming inside the small space. The nose of the commercial airliner pitched down at an incredibly steep, unnatural angle. The captain grabbed the yoke with both hands, pulling back with absolutely every ounce of strength he had in his arms, desperately trying to pull the nose of the plane back up. But the hydraulic lines had been completely severed. The heavy metal control surfaces on the tail of the aircraft were completely gone. The plane was entirely dead in the air. The blue sky outside the small oval windows in the passenger cabin was entirely replaced by the rapidly approaching green and brown squares of the farmland far below. Down on the ground in the rural farming town of Shizukuishi, a local man was standing knee-deep in a flooded rice paddy, his hands completely covered in thick, dark mud. The afternoon sun was beating down hard on his back. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his forearm and leaned heavily on his wooden farming tool. And then he heard a sound that completely defied logic. It was a massive, rolling boom of thunder, but there was not a single dark rain cloud anywhere in the entire sky. He stood up straight and looked toward the mountains. High above the green peaks, he saw a bright flash of silver, followed immediately by a thick, dark column of black smoke rapidly trailing downward. He just stood there in the muddy water, watching as the massive burning object plummeted toward the earth. And then it started to rain metal. Heavy pieces of shredded aluminum, a leather suitcase, a completely mangled airline seat, and unrecognizable debris began splashing violently into the flooded paddies and crashing through the wooden roofs of the nearby barns. The sound of the metal hitting the ground was absolutely deafening. The farmer dropped his tool, waded quickly out of the water, and ran toward the nearest dirt road. All around him, other villagers were running out of their homes, pointing up at the sky, and completely covering their heads as small pieces of twisted metal and fiberglass rained down on the dirt streets. A massive column of thick black smoke began rising from the dense forest just a few miles outside of the village limits. Within an hour, dozens of dark green military trucks and local police cruisers bounced heavily down the rutted dirt roads leading into the forest. Hundreds of uniformed men jumped out of the backs of the trucks, carrying heavy axes, shovels, and medical bags. They pushed their way through the thick underbrush, cutting down small trees to clear a path toward the rising smoke. When they finally broke through the tree line, they found a massive, smoking crater carved deeply into the side of the mountain. The sheer scale of the destruction was absolute. The massive Boeing 727 had been completely pulverized upon impact. There was absolutely no fuselage left intact. The trees surrounding the crater were completely snapped in half and covered in thick, burning jet fuel. The air smelled strongly of scorched earth, melted plastic, and raw kerosene. The rescue workers immediately spread out across the burning debris field, calling out and looking for anyone who might have survived the impact. They walked carefully over the hot metal shining flashlights into the dark, twisted wreckage. But it did not take long for the search and rescue operation to completely transition into a recovery mission. The impact forces had been entirely unsurvivable. Every single person who had boarded that plane in Sapporo, the businessmen, the stewardesses, the captain, and Keiko and her young son, were completely gone. The authorities quickly established a massive perimeter around the forest, stringing long lines of yellow rope between the trees to keep the local villagers away from the wreckage. For the next several days, the entire town of Shizukuishi was completely overrun by government officials and aviation investigators in dark suits. They set up a massive command center inside a local school gymnasium. The search grid was expanded to cover miles of dense, unforgiving mountain terrain and thick forests because the plane had clearly begun breaking apart long before it hit the ground. Investigators wearing heavy boots waded through the mud of the rice paddies, placing small orange flags next to every single piece of shredded aluminum and twisted wire they found. They recovered the heavy, bright orange flight data recorders from a deep hole in the soil and shipped them immediately to a laboratory in Tokyo. Hundreds of workers carried the recovered pieces of the aircraft down the mountain and laid them out on the wooden floor of the gymnasium, essentially trying to rebuild the plane like a massive, morbid jigsaw puzzle. As the lead structural engineers walked slowly around the reconstructed tail section of the aircraft, they noticed something completely wrong. The heavy horizontal stabilizer, which is the small wing attached to the very back of the tail, was completely sheared off. But the engineers could clearly see that the metal had not failed from standard metal fatigue, and it had not been blown outward by an internal bomb. The edges of the torn thick aluminum were bent sharply inward, meaning something incredibly heavy and completely solid had struck the tail from the outside with an immense amount of force. The investigators grabbed large magnifying glasses and knelt down on the wooden floor to examine the point of impact much closer. Painted directly onto the scraped, crushed aluminum of the Boeing, right at the exact center of the impact zone, was a long, thick streak of bright, unnatural orange paint. The investigators just stared at this paint transfer in complete silence. Commercial airlines, like All Nippon Airways, absolutely did not use that highly specific, high-visibility shade of orange paint on their aircraft. But the investigators knew exactly who did. That specific shade of orange was exclusively used on the training aircraft flown by the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force. The commercial airliner had not crashed due to a mechanical failure. It had been physically struck in mid-air by a military jet. Based on the official Japan Transport Safety Board accident reports, military radar transcripts, and later court documents, here is a reconstruction of what actually happened in the sky that afternoon. At 1:30 in the afternoon, a 22-year-old student pilot sat in the cramped, incredibly tight cockpit of an F-86 Sabre fighter jet on the hot concrete tarmac of a nearby military airbase. He was wearing a heavy olive-green flight suit and a thick white helmet. He pulled his dark oxygen mask up over his nose and mouth, listening to the sharp, rhythmic sound of his own breathing echoing in the small radio earpiece. He ran his gloved hands over the dials, checking his fuel levels and hydraulic pressure. Sitting in an identical fighter jet just a few yards away was his senior flight instructor. The instructor's voice cracked over the radio, telling the student to initiate the takeoff sequence. The young man pushed the heavy throttle forward, feeling the massive raw power of the jet engine push him hard back into his ejection seat. The two fighter jets shot down the runway and pulled straight up into the sky, climbing rapidly side by side. They were scheduled to practice basic air-to-air evasion maneuvers. The instructor told the student to follow him as they climbed all the way up to 28,000 feet. The air outside the thick glass canopy was completely clear and brightly lit by the afternoon sun. The instructor suddenly banked his jet hard to the right, initiating the drill. The young student pilot immediately pulled his stick to follow, pushing his body against the heavy G-forces. He kept his eyes locked on the silver tail of his instructor's jet. But as they completed a wide, sweeping loop, the student lost visual contact. He snapped his head from left to right, looking through the canopy, desperately trying to find the other small, fast-moving fighter jet. He checked his radar screen and checked his mirrors. He was completely focused on scanning the empty blue space directly around him. He completely failed to realize that during his wide turn, he had drifted entirely out of the designated military training airspace and had flown directly into the highly trafficked commercial flight corridor. He looked forward through his thick glass canopy, and suddenly the entire sky was completely blocked out by a massive gray wall of metal. It was the tail section of the Boeing 727 cruising directly across his flight path. He had absolutely no time to pull up. No time to bank. He just gripped the control stick tightly as the nose of his fighter jet slammed directly into the tail of the commercial airliner at hundreds of miles per hour. The massive impact completely shredded the front of his fighter jet, instantly crushing the nose cone and tearing the right wing completely off the fuselage. The control stick in his hands went totally dead. His fighter jet instantly began to spin wildly out of control, throwing him incredibly hard against the side of the narrow cockpit. The warning alarms were screaming in his ears and smoke was pouring into the cabin. He knew the jet was completely dead and entirely unrecoverable. So he reached his gloved hands down between his knees, grabbed the heavy yellow and black striped handle of his ejection seat, and pulled it as hard as he could. Explosive charges instantly blew the heavy glass canopy completely off the jet, sending it tumbling away into the sky. A split second later, a solid rocket motor ignited directly under his seat, blasting him violently up into the freezing thin air. The sheer force of the wind hit him like a concrete wall, knocking the breath completely out of his lungs. He tumbled uncontrollably through the sky for a few seconds before his parachute automatically deployed with a hard, violent jerk, pulling him completely upright. He hung there in the quiet, freezing air, drifting slowly downward under his large white canopy. He looked down at his heavy boots, and then he looked further down toward the ground. He watched in absolute silence as the massive commercial airliner, completely crippled by his mistake, plummeted directly toward the earth. He eventually landed safely in a rural field of tall, wet grass. He unclipped his parachute harness, dropped his heavy helmet in the dirt, and just sat there on the ground, waiting for the authorities to arrive. The 22-year-old student pilot survived the deadliest aviation disaster in history at the time with absolutely no physical injuries. He was subsequently arrested by the military police, put on trial, and convicted of involuntary manslaughter. 162 civilians lost their lives simply because a student drifted out of his lane, creating a devastating split-second collision where the person who caused the absolute destruction was the only one who got to walk away from it.